Hello everyone and welcome back to the Horror Hut. Now, I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off I thought it would be a fun idea if everyone can leave a comment and let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episodes. Right, let's get comfy and relax and let's begin. The night shifts at the library were always quiet, almost too quiet. It was just me, the books, and the faint hum of the air conditioning. Most nights, I welcomed the solitude. I could sort returns, straighten the shelves, and get lost in my thoughts without interruption. That night started the same as any other. The last few patrons had left at 8 p.m., and I locked the doors behind them. I had 2 hours before I could shut everything down and head home. I spent the first hour organizing the mystery section. Someone had returned a whole stack of Agatha Christie novels, and I liked putting them back where they belonged. The silence was comforting at first, the kind that felt safe. But as the clock ticked closer to closing, it started to feel heavier, like the air was pressing down on me. At 9:45, I decided to do a final walkthrough to make sure everything was in order. The library wasn't big, just one main floor with rows of bookshelves and a small reading area by the windows. I walked the aisles, straightening books and picking up stray bits of trash left behind. Everything was normal until I reached the back corner where the biographies were. That's when I saw him. He was crouched low behind one of the shelves, almost completely hidden. I only noticed him because of a flicker of movement, the way his shoes shifted against the carpet. My first thought was that it was a teenager, someone who had stayed behind as a prank. It had happened once before. Some kids thought it would be funny to hide until closing and scare me when I turned out the lights. "Excuse me," I said, my voice firmer than I felt. "We're closed. You need to leave." He didn't move at first. I couldn't see his face, just the top of his head and the way his shoulders hunched forward. I took a step closer, keeping the shelf between us. "Sir?" I tried again, louder this time. He straightened slowly, like he had all the time in the world. When he stood, I realized he wasn't a teenager. He was a grown man, maybe in his late 30s or early 40s. His clothes were plain dark jeans, a gray hoodie, but there was something about the way he carried himself that put me on edge. His hands hung loose at his sides, and his head tilted slightly, like he was sizing me up. "I didn't mean to startle you," he said, his voice calm, almost polite. "We're closed," I said again. "You shouldn't be here." He didn't move. Instead, he took a small step toward me, just enough to close the distance by a few inches. "I was just looking around," he said. "It's a nice library." "You work here?" "Yes," I said, keeping my voice steady. "But you need to leave. Now." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "What's your name?" I ignored the question and took a step back. "I'm going to have to call security if you don't leave." His smile widened, and he leaned slightly against the shelf, like he wasn't in any hurry. "Security? Do you even have security here?" The question hit me harder than it should have. He was right. The library didn't have a security guard, not during my shifts. It was just me, a locked door, and the assumption that no one would bother causing trouble in a place like this. "I'll call the police," I said, reaching for my phone in my back pocket. He moved fast, stepping out from behind the shelf and blocking the aisle before I could react. "There's no need for that," he said. His tone was smooth, almost friendly, but his body language was anything but. He was too close, standing just a little too tall, and his eyes never left mine. "I'm just trying to finish my shift," I said, keeping my voice as calm as I could. "Please leave." Instead of answering, he took another step forward, forcing me to back up. "Do you work here alone?" he asked, his head tilting again. It must get lonely. My throat tightened. That's none of your business. He chuckled, low and soft, like I'd said something funny. You're not very friendly, are you? Most people who work in places like this are friendlier. I didn't answer. My phone was still in my pocket, but I didn't want to reach for it again. He was too close, and I didn't want to give him a reason to grab me. My heart was pounding, and I was hyper-aware of how empty the building was, how far I was from the front door. Do you live around here? He asked. It's a small town. I bet you're easy to find. I tried to stay calm, but his words sent a cold rush of fear through me. You need to leave, I said again, my voice sharper now. He didn't flinch. Instead, he took a slow step to the side, forcing me to move further into the corner. The shelves behind me felt like walls, boxing me in. You've got a nice voice, he said, almost like he was complimenting me. I bet people tell you that all the time. I'm calling the police, I said, pulling my phone out and unlocking it with shaking hands. Before I could dial, he lunged forward, grabbing my wrist. Don't, he said, his tone still calm but his grip iron tight. I twisted, trying to pull free, but he held on. Let go! I yelled, my voice echoing through the empty library. He didn't let go, but his smile faded. Calm down, he said. You're overreacting. I didn't care about overreacting. I swung my other hand, hitting his arm as hard as I could. It was enough to loosen his grip, and I yanked my wrist free, stumbling backward. He didn't come after me right away. Instead, he just stood there, his head tilted again like he was trying to figure something out. You're making this harder than it needs to be, he said. I didn't respond. My back hit the shelf, and I used it to steady myself before darting down the next aisle. I could hear his footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate. He wasn't running, but he wasn't letting me out of his sight either. I reached the front desk and grabbed the landline phone, dialing 911 as quickly as I could. My hands were shaking so badly that I almost dropped the receiver. 911, what's your emergency? The operator said. There's a man in the library, I said, my voice trembling. He won't leave. He's threatening me. Before I could say more, he appeared at the end of the aisle, his face calm but his eyes cold. You really didn't need to do that, he said, stepping closer. They're on their way, I said, holding the phone like a shield. Just leave. He stopped, his expression unreadable. For a moment, I thought he might actually listen, but then he took another step forward. You think they'll get here in time? The operator was still talking, but I couldn't focus on her words. My entire body was tense, ready to run if I had to. I backed toward the door, keeping my eyes on him. Then I heard it, the faint sound of sirens in the distance. His expression changed, a flicker of frustration crossing his face. He glanced toward the window, then back at me. You got lucky, he said, his voice low. He turned and walked quickly toward the back of the library, disappearing between the shelves. I didn't wait to see where he went. I ran to the door, unlocking it just as the first police car pulled into the lot. The officers searched the building, but they didn't find him. They said he must have slipped out through the emergency exit before they arrived. They offered to walk me to my car and told me to call if I saw anything suspicious. I didn't sleep that night. I kept replaying his words, his calm smile, and the way he seemed to know exactly how far he could push without crossing the line. I still don't know what he wanted or why he was there, but I quit the job the next day. It happened a few months ago, and I still can't believe it. I was driving through the desert, heading to a job out west. It was one of those stretches of highway where you can go hours without seeing another car or a building. Just miles of sand, scrubby bushes, and the occasional cactus. I'd been on the road all day, and the sun was starting to set, the light fading into the deep orange that paints everything in long shadows. It should have been peaceful, but I had this nagging worry my fuel gauge was getting close to empty. I passed a sign about 20 miles back that said there was a gas station up ahead, so I kept going, hoping I'd make it before running out. But, of course, the needle dipped lower, and the engine started sputtering before I saw anything. I coasted as far as I could and pulled over to the shoulder. There was nothing around but the sound of the wind brushing over the sand. I grabbed a flashlight and my phone, which was barely holding a charge, and started walking. I figured the station couldn't be too far. After what felt like a mile or so, I finally saw it, a rundown gas station just off the highway. The place looked like it had been abandoned for years. The sign was half falling down, and the windows were all covered in grime. Still, I thought maybe there'd be something there, an old gas can, maybe someone who could help. Anything. When I got closer, I saw the pumps were completely rusted out. The station itself had its front door hanging open, creaking softly in the wind. I hesitated before stepping inside. It was dark, but my flashlight cut through enough to see the place was a wreck. Shelves were knocked over, and trash was scattered everywhere. It smelled stale, like mold and dust. I started looking around, keeping the flashlight low. There were some old cans of food, but they were bloated and clearly not safe to eat. I found an old toolbox on one of the shelves and grabbed it, thinking it might come in handy. That's when I felt it, like someone was watching me. You know that prickly feeling on the back of your neck? It was like that, but stronger. I swung the flashlight around, but the beam only landed on empty aisles and dusty corners. I told myself it was just my nerves. The place was creepy, sure, but I was alone. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. Then I heard it, a soft shuffle, like a footstep, coming from the back of the store. My heart jumped into my throat. I called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" My voice sounded too loud, almost shaky. No answer, just the wind pushing through the broken windows. I stepped back, keeping the flashlight pointed toward the noise. The shuffling stopped, but I thought I saw something move in the shadows. It was quick, like someone ducking out of sight. That was enough for me. I turned and bolted for the door, toolbox clanging in my hand. When I got outside, I glanced back over my shoulder. I didn't see anyone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I started walking back to my car, faster this time. The desert was pitch black by then, and my flashlight wasn't doing much against the dark. The air felt colder, and every little noise made me jump. When I finally saw my car up ahead, I felt a wave of relief. But as I got closer, that relief turned to dread. The driver's side door was open. I knew I'd locked it before I left. My chest tightened, and I slowed my steps, scanning around with the flashlight. There was no one in sight, but the inside of the car looked off. The glove box was open, papers were scattered on the seat, and the back door was ajar. Someone had been in there. I reached the car and peeked inside, half expecting someone to jump out at me. But it was empty. I checked my phone. The battery was dead. Figures. I tried to start the car, but it wouldn't even turn over. Popping the hood, I saw why the wires had been cut. My heart sank. Someone had done this while I was at the station. That's when I heard it again, footsteps, this time on the gravel behind me. Slow, deliberate. I whipped around, flashlight trembling in my hand, and finally saw him. A man stood just at the edge of the light, half hidden in the dark. He was tall and thin, wearing a dirty jacket and jeans. His face was mostly shadowed, but I could see the glint of his eyes staring at me. He didn't say anything, just stood there, watching. My mouth went dry, and my hand shook so bad I almost dropped the flashlight. "What do you want?" I managed to say, my voice cracking. He didn't answer. Instead, he took a step closer, his boots crunching on the gravel. I backed up until I hit the car, my mind racing. I still had the toolbox in my hand, so I gripped it tight, ready to swing if I had to. "Stay back," I shouted. My voice echoed into the empty night. The man stopped, tilting his head slightly, like he was sizing me up. Then he took another step. I didn't wait to see what he'd do next. I turned and ran, leaving the car and everything else behind. My legs burned as I sprinted down the highway, the flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know if he was following. After what felt like forever, I saw headlights coming toward me. I waved my arms, yelling and stumbling into the middle of the road. The car slowed, and a woman rolled down her window, looking concerned. "Are you okay?" she asked. I could barely get the words out, telling her someone was back at my car. She told me to get in, and I didn't hesitate. We drove to the nearest town, about 20 miles away. I told the cops everything, but when they went back to check, my car was gone. The only thing they found was the toolbox I'd dropped and some footprints leading into the desert. They said it was probably some drifter or maybe a car thief, but I don't know. Something about that man felt wrong. Like he'd been waiting for someone to come along. I've thought about it a lot since then, and I'm just glad I got out of there. I don't know what would have happened if I'd stayed, and I don't want to know. All I can say is, if you ever find yourself out in the desert, low on gas, and thinking about walking to some old station for help, don't. I decided to spend a weekend ice fishing alone. It was something I'd done plenty of times before, but this time felt different. The weather had been bad, with heavy snowstorms hitting earlier that week, but by Saturday morning, the sky was clear. The cold didn't bother me much. I liked the quiet out there on the ice. The lake I chose was about an hour from my house, surrounded by nothing but woods. In the winter, it turned into a white expanse, just ice and snow stretching as far as you could see. I set up my hut near the middle of the lake, not too close to the shore but far enough from where I had parked my truck. The ice was thick enough for safety, and I could see a few other huts scattered around, but not many. Most people weren't out that day, maybe because of how bad the weather had been earlier. The first few hours were uneventful. I caught a couple of small fish and drank some coffee from my thermos to keep warm. The wind was strong, making the walls of my hut flap every so often, but it wasn't bad enough to bother me. I liked being out there alone. Around mid-afternoon, I saw someone waving from a distance. At first, I thought it was just someone being friendly. The hut was maybe 100 yards away, and the figure stood outside, raising an arm and lowering it again. It didn't look frantic, just slow, like they were trying to get my attention. I waved back but didn't think much of it. Sometimes people did that, just acknowledging another person on the ice. But they didn't stop. The arm kept going up and down, deliberate, like they really wanted me to come over. I put down my rod and stepped outside for a better look. The person was wearing a heavy jacket and a knit cap, and I could just make out the outline of their body against the white backdrop. They weren't moving other than the waving. The closer I looked, the stranger it felt. Most people out here wouldn't leave their hut for long, it was too cold for that. But this person didn't seem to care about the cold or even what they were doing. They just stood there, waving. I thought maybe something was wrong. They might have been stuck or hurt, so I decided to go over. I grabbed my coat, slipped on my gloves, and started walking toward their hut. It wasn't far, but the wind was picking up, cutting across the ice and making it hard to see. I kept my eyes on them as I walked, but something felt off. They didn't move from the spot. They just stood there, still waving. I shouted out to ask if they were okay, but the wind carried my voice away, and they didn't respond. As I got closer, maybe 20 or 30 yards out, I realized I couldn't see their face. The hood of their jacket was pulled down low, and the light was strange, making it hard to see any features. I slowed down, suddenly unsure if I wanted to get any closer. Then they stopped waving. They stood there for a moment, completely still. My boots crunched on the ice, and the sound felt too loud, too sharp against the quiet. I called out again, asking if they needed help. No answer. Before I could get closer, the person turned and walked toward the hut. It was slow, not hurried, like they knew I would follow. My first thought was that maybe they were injured or too cold to speak, so I kept going. The hut was just ahead now, and I could see the door hanging slightly open. I stepped up to it and knocked on the frame. No answer. I called out again, saying I was coming in, and pushed the door wider. Inside, the hut was empty. There was no one there. Just an overturned chair and some scattered fishing gear on the floor. A hole had been drilled in the ice, but the line wasn't in the water. The place looked abandoned, but it didn't make sense. I had just seen someone walk inside. Then I noticed the blood. It wasn't much at first, just a few dark drops near the hole. But when I looked closer, I saw more. A thin trail led from the chair to the door I had just walked through, like someone had been bleeding and moved outside. The snow near the hut was disturbed, the footprints messy and scattered, but they led away from the door, out toward the far edge of the lake. My first thought was that the person had gotten hurt and gone to get help. But there was no truck parked on the ice, and the nearest road was miles away. There was no way anyone could walk out of there in that condition. I stood there, trying to make sense of it, but the longer I looked at the trail, the more uneasy I felt. The footprints weren't consistent. They started clear, but then they changed, like whoever it was had started dragging one foot or crawling. The blood drops grew heavier the farther they went. I wanted to leave. The whole thing felt wrong, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I turned back toward my own hut, but before I could take a step, I heard a sound behind me, coming from the woods at the edge of the lake. It was faint at first, a crunching noise like something moving through the snow. I stopped and listened, my breath clouding in the air. The sound came again, closer this time, and I realized it wasn't just one set of footsteps. There were multiple, coming from the direction of the blood trail. I didn't wait to see what it was. I turned and started running back toward my hut, the cold air burning my lungs. My boots slipped on the ice, and I nearly fell, but I kept going. Behind me, the crunching grew louder, faster, like whatever was out there was following me. When I reached my hut, I didn't stop. I grabbed my gear, threw it into my sled, and started toward my truck. The wind was biting, and the sled kept catching on the uneven ice, but I didn't look back. I couldn't. By the time I reached the truck, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key into the lock. I climbed in, started the engine, and peeled out onto the road, not caring about the ice or the conditions. I just wanted to get away. I don't know what I saw out there or what happened to the person who had been waving at me. I've thought about going back, trying to figure it out, but every time I do, I remember that sound of the crunching footsteps closing in, and I can't bring myself to do it. Whatever happened on that lake, I don't think I want to know. When I first moved into the apartment, I thought it was perfect. It was small but clean, with big windows overlooking the city. I liked how high up it was, the 23rd floor. It felt private, safe. I spent the first few days unpacking, making the place feel like mine. I didn't really know anyone in the building, but the few neighbors I ran into seemed nice enough. Quiet. That was fine with me. I wasn't looking to make friends. The first note showed up about a week after I moved in. It was stuck to my front door, a little yellow sticky note with uneven handwriting that said, "I saw you last night." At first, I thought it was a mistake. Maybe someone meant to leave it for another apartment and got the wrong door. I pulled it off, threw it away, and didn't think much of it. The next morning, there was another one. Same kind of sticky note, same handwriting. "You looked beautiful." That one made me stop. I stood there in the hallway, staring at the note, my heart beating a little faster. I didn't know anyone in the building, and no one knew me. How could someone think I looked beautiful? Were they watching me through the windows? Did they see me when I went to the mailbox? I kept looking up and down the hallway, but it was empty. No sound except the faint hum of an air vent. I took the note inside and locked the door. That night, I made sure to close the blinds and double-check the locks before bed. I tried to tell myself it wasn't a big deal. Maybe it was just some kid messing around. But I didn't sleep well. The notes kept coming. Every morning, I'd find one stuck to my door. "Do you remember me? I've missed you. You're even prettier than before." They were all written in the same scratchy handwriting, and every one of them made me feel more on edge. I didn't know who was leaving them or how they were getting into the building. The front door had a key code, and you needed a fob to use the elevator. I told the building manager about it, hoping maybe they'd check the security cameras. But all he said was that the cameras in the hallways weren't working and wouldn't be fixed until the end of the month. He didn't seem too concerned. He said it was probably a neighbor with a weird sense of humor. I didn't feel like laughing. I started keeping a kitchen knife next to my bed. I told myself I was being paranoid, but I couldn't help it. Every time I walked to my door, my chest would tighten, waiting to see if there was another note. There always was. One night, I stayed up late, sitting by the peephole with the lights off, waiting to see if I could catch whoever was leaving them. It was quiet in the hallway, just the occasional creak of the floor above or a muffled TV from another apartment. I sat there for hours, my back starting to ache, but no one came. I finally went to bed, feeling tired and frustrated. The next morning, there was another note. This time, it said, "You shouldn't try to watch me." That made my stomach drop. They knew. Somehow, they knew I was there, waiting. Were they watching me through the peephole? Did they hear me move? I called the police that day. I told them everything, the notes, the handwriting, the way it made me feel like I wasn't alone in my own apartment. They sent an officer to take a report, but he didn't seem hopeful. He said without proof, there wasn't much they could do. He suggested I get a door camera, but I didn't have the money for that. That night, I slept with the lights on. The next note was worse. "I can see you right now." I froze when I read it, my hand shaking so badly I dropped it. I ran to the windows, pulling the blinds tighter, checking the locks again and again. I thought about calling the police, but what could I tell them? Another note? They wouldn't take it seriously. I stayed inside all day, too scared to leave. I didn't even feel safe taking a shower. What if they came in while I was in there? I kept thinking about the officer's suggestion and finally borrowed some money from my sister to buy a cheap camera. I set it up the next morning, pointing it at my door, and hoped it would catch something. That night, I kept checking the feed on my phone, looking for any movement. The hallway stayed empty, quiet. No one came near my door. I started to think maybe the notes would stop now that I had the camera. In the morning, there was another note. Nice camera. Won't help you. I felt sick reading it. They'd seen the camera, and they still came. They weren't afraid of being caught. They wanted me to know they were watching. I packed a bag that day. I couldn't stay there anymore. I called my sister and told her I needed to crash at her place for a while. She didn't ask too many questions, just said I could come whenever. I didn't care about the lease or the rent, I just wanted to leave. But as I was locking up the apartment, I heard footsteps behind me. Slow, deliberate steps coming down the hallway. I turned, and there was a man standing a few doors down. He was tall, with a hoodie pulled low over his face. He wasn't carrying anything, just standing there, staring at me. I didn't wait to see what he wanted. I bolted for the elevator, slamming the button over and over until the doors opened. When they did, I jumped inside and hit the ground floor. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I didn't look back as I ran to my car. I just drove, not even sure where I was going at first. I ended up at my sister's, and I told her everything. She helped me file another police report, but I didn't go back to the apartment. My sister helped me break the lease, and I moved out of the city altogether. I still don't know who was leaving the notes or how they got into the building. I don't want to know. Sometimes I think about that last note, the one about the camera. Whoever it was, they weren't just watching me, they wanted me to know they could get to me anytime. And that's what scares me the most. It was late, almost midnight, when I finally locked the doors. The rain had started earlier in the evening, and by the time the last customers were gone, it was coming down in thick sheets. The diner was silent except for the steady patter against the windows and the hum of the overhead lights. I'd finished wiping down the counters and was about to turn off the neon open sign when I saw him. He was standing outside, soaked to the bone, his dark coat clinging to him like a second skin. His hair was plastered to his forehead, and the rain streamed down his face. He didn't knock, didn't gesture, just stood there, staring at me through the glass. I hesitated. The diner was in the middle of nowhere, just off the highway, and I was the only one here. It wasn't unusual to get late-night stragglers, but something about him made me uneasy. Still, it was cold, and he looked miserable. I opened the door a crack, careful to keep the chain on. "We're closed," I said. "Please," he said, his voice low but steady. "I need to come inside." I glanced out at the parking lot. His car wasn't there, just mine, sitting under the lone streetlight. "The storm's bad," he added. "I won't stay long." Against my better judgment, I unlatched the chain and stepped back. He stepped inside without thanking me, dripping water onto the linoleum. Up close, he looked worse. His cheeks were hollow, and his eyes were sharp and glassy, darting around the room like he was scanning it for something. I started to ask if he wanted coffee, but he interrupted me. "Do you work here alone?" His tone was flat, but there was something unsettling about the way he asked, like it wasn't really a question. Yeah," I said, gripping the edge of the counter. "But we're closed, so." "Must be quiet out here at night," he said, cutting me off again. "Just you and the highway." "Look, if you need to wait out the storm, fine," I said, trying to sound firm. "But I'm closing up." He didn't respond. Instead, he walked to one of the booths and sat down, water pooling under him. His head turned slowly, taking in the room. It felt like he wasn't looking at the diner but searching for something specific. Or someone. I stayed behind the counter, my heart pounding. "You've worked here long?" he asked after a minute, his voice breaking the silence. "Couple of years," I said. "Why?" He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "You like it?" "It's a job." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Do they know about you?" he asked. My stomach tightened. "What are you talking about?" "Your boss. Your customers. Do they know what you've done?" The words hit me like a punch to the gut. "I think you've got the wrong person," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He shook his head slowly, like he didn't believe me. "No," he said. "I don't." I wanted to tell him to leave, but the words caught in my throat. He wasn't shouting, wasn't threatening me, but there was something about the way he spoke that made me feel trapped, like he'd already decided how this night was going to go. "I don't know you," I said finally. "You need to leave." He leaned back, folding his arms across his chest. "You don't remember me?" "No," I said. "I don't." His smile faded. For a moment, he just stared at me, his eyes unblinking. Then he reached into his coat pocket. My hand shot to the phone on the counter, ready to call 911, but he didn't pull out a weapon. Instead, he placed something small and metallic on the table, a key. "You drop this," he said. I frowned. "That's not mine." "Isn't it?" he asked, tilting his head. "You sure?" "I've never seen it before." He pushed it toward the edge of the table, his fingers lingering on it. "You'd say that, wouldn't you?" I took a step back, my heart racing. "Look, I don't know what your problem is, but..." "My problem?" he snapped, his voice rising for the first time. "My problem is people like you. People who think they can do whatever they want and get away with it." I froze. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do," he said, standing up. The movement was sudden, jerky, like he was barely holding himself together. "You think I didn't see you? You think I don't know?" My mouth was dry. "See me do what?" He didn't answer. Instead, he started pacing, his wet shoes squeaking against the floor. "I've been watching you," he said. "I've seen how you look at people. How you smile at them, like nothing's wrong. Like you're normal." I grabbed the phone, my fingers trembling as I dialed. "I'm calling the police." "No, you're not," he said, his voice calm again. He stopped pacing and turned to face me. "Because they won't believe you." I hit call anyway, pressing the phone to my ear. It rang once, twice, and then the line went dead. I stared at the screen, my breath catching in my throat. No signal. There'd been signal earlier. I'd used my phone to check the weather. "I told you," he said. "They won't help you." I backed toward the door, my mind racing. "Get out," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. "Now." He didn't move. "You can run," he said. "But it won't change anything." I didn't wait to hear what else he had to say. I bolted for the door, fumbling with the lock. The rain hit me like a wall as I stumbled outside, the cold air stealing my breath. My car was only a few feet away, but it felt like miles. I dug into my pocket for the keys, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped them. Behind me, the door to the diner slammed open. I didn't look back. I threw myself into the driver's seat, locking the doors and starting the engine. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the parking lot. He was standing in the doorway, his face expressionless. I didn't wait. I hit the gas, skidding onto the highway. The rain made it hard to see, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get as far away as possible. My heart didn't stop racing until I saw the lights of a town up ahead. I never went back to that diner. The manager called the next day, asking why I'd left without locking up. I told him the truth, but he didn't believe me. Said the camera showed the place was empty when he arrived. Said there was no sign of anyone breaking in. But I know what happened. I know he was there. And I know he'll be back. I'd been hiking alone for a few hours when I decided to stop for a quick break. It was one of those clear, quiet days, just the sound of birds and the occasional rustling in the bushes. There was a good, flat spot right off the trail, so I dropped my pack and sat down to take a drink from my water bottle. I must have zoned out a bit, staring at the trees and feeling relaxed. When I reached back to grab my backpack, it wasn't there. For a second, I thought I was imagining it. Maybe I'd put it down somewhere else. But I looked around, and it was definitely gone. I felt this twist of panic in my stomach, and I scanned the area, my eyes jumping from tree to tree, hoping maybe I'd just forgotten where I'd put it. But then, about 30 feet up the trail, I spotted a man crouched down, holding my pack. My heart started pounding. I hadn't seen anyone all day, and suddenly there was this guy, going through my stuff like he owned it. He was turned away from me, so I couldn't see his face, but he was bent over my bag, pulling things out one by one, looking at each item before setting it down in the dirt. "Hey!" I called out, walking toward him, trying to keep my voice steady. "That's my backpack." He didn't even turn around, just kept rummaging through it, like he hadn't heard me or didn't care. I got closer, and I could see his hands running over my things, almost like he was taking his time with each one. I stopped a few feet away, feeling this tightness in my throat. I said, "That's my bag," I repeated, louder this time, trying to sound firm. Finally, he turned around. He was middle-aged, rough-looking, with a scruffy beard and eyes that didn't quite meet mine. He held onto my pack, keeping it close to him, as if it was his now. He looked me over, up and down, then said, "You left it unattended." Just sitting there. His voice was flat, like he was stating a fact that justified what he was doing. I took a deep breath, keeping my voice steady. I was only gone for a minute. I just needed a break. I didn't think anyone else was out here. He didn't respond, just looked at me, still holding onto my pack. I took a step forward, reaching my hand out. "I really need that back," I said, trying not to sound as nervous as I felt. He didn't budge. Instead, he tilted his head and asked, "Where are you heading?" I froze for a second. It was such a strange question, like he wasn't really interested in returning my things. I tried to keep calm and said, "I'm just hiking through, that's all. But I need my gear." He looked at my bag again, then slowly shifted his gaze back to me. "You're hiking alone?" That question made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I hadn't told anyone I was alone. I glanced around, feeling more aware of how isolated we were. "Just give me my backpack," I said, trying to keep my voice firm but not wanting to answer anything he asked. He ignored me, still holding my things like he had every right to. He reached into my bag and pulled out my map, unfolding it with this slow, deliberate care. He stared at it, his finger tracing the route I had marked out, as if he was planning to follow it himself. "You marked this?" he asked, glancing up at me with a look that made my skin crawl. "Yeah," I said, not knowing what else to say. My voice was starting to shake now, and I felt a strange, hollow feeling in my chest. It's my route. Look, I really need that back. Please. But he just kept staring at the map, running his finger along my planned path. He looked up again and said, "Not many people come up this far. No one around to hear you, really." His eyes met mine, and he held that stare a bit too long. I felt this wave of dread, like something heavy pressing down on me. My mind was racing, thinking about what I'd do if he tried anything. I tried to make my voice sound stronger, even though I was terrified. "Give me my backpack," I demanded, taking another step forward. He didn't move. Instead, he raised an eyebrow and asked, "You sure you're going the right way?" "What?" I asked, not understanding what he was getting at. He folded the map slowly, stuffing it back into my pack, then looked at me with this strange smile. "Just saying, you could easily get turned around out here. And no one would know." His voice was low, almost like he was enjoying himself. I took a deep breath, trying to hold my ground. "I know where I'm going. I've got my route mapped out. Now, give me my things." He stared at me, and for a long second, I thought he was going to ignore me, or worse. But then he shoved the bag toward me, not letting go until I was practically pulling it out of his hands. When I grabbed it, he leaned in close, closer than he needed to, and said in a quiet voice, "Maybe I'll see you again." My heart was pounding as I took a few steps back, not turning my back on him. I held onto my bag tight, my mind racing, but I didn't respond. I just wanted to get out of there. He watched me, that same unsettling look in his eyes, like he was memorizing my face, or maybe planning something. I turned and started walking fast, almost running, trying to put as much distance as I could between us. I glanced back a couple of times, and he was still standing there, watching me until I disappeared into the trees. I didn't stop, didn't rest, didn't look back again until I was way down the trail, far enough that I couldn't see him or hear anything. I kept my hand on the straps of my pack, clutching it close, heart racing the whole way back. It was late, around 1 a.m., and I had just finished a long shift at the office. I was tired, my mind was foggy, and all I wanted to do was get home and get some sleep. My car was running fine, nothing unusual. But as I turned down a quiet stretch of road, my engine sputtered, and then it just died. I tried restarting it a few times, but nothing happened. I knew I was far from the nearest gas station or anything resembling help. The road was dark, only a few houses scattered here and there, far enough that they couldn't help me in time if something went wrong. I didn't panic, though. I was prepared for moments like this. I pulled out my phone, got on the roadside assistance app, and requested a tow. The app said it would be about 40 minutes before help arrived. Fine. I could wait. I stayed in the car, locked the doors, and tried to make myself comfortable as best I could. About 15 minutes later, I noticed headlights in my rearview mirror. At first, I thought it was the tow truck, but the truck kept getting closer and closer, then pulled up next to me. I glanced over, and the driver rolled down his window. "Hey, need a hand?" he asked. I looked over at him. He was in a beat-up pickup truck, wearing a baseball cap and a flannel shirt. At first, I thought he might be a good Samaritan, someone trying to help. But then I noticed something in his eyes, something that made me hesitant. His stare was a little too intense, a little too focused. It felt wrong, like he was eyeing me more than my car. "No, I'm fine," I said, trying to sound calm and polite. "I've called for a tow truck. They should be here soon." The man didn't respond immediately. He just stared at me for a moment, his eyes flicking over my car like he was inspecting it, and then he said, "You sure? I could take a look, help you out. You don't want to wait out here alone." I shook my head. "Really, I'm fine. The tow truck's on the way." There was a long pause. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Something in the air changed. I couldn't explain it, but it was like I knew something was wrong. Maybe it was the way he was looking at me or how he hadn't left after I told him I was fine. Then, without saying another word, the man shifted the truck into reverse and slowly started to circle around my car, driving in a wide arc. I watched him through the rearview mirror, feeling uneasy as he drove past me and came around again, slowly, like he was studying the car. I looked around quickly, checking if there were any other cars, any lights from a nearby house. But everything around me was dark. Empty. I locked my doors and rolled up the windows, just to be sure. He kept driving in circles, coming around again and again, like he was looking for something. I started to feel my heart beat faster. Why wasn't he leaving? I didn't need help. Why wasn't he going? I leaned over to grab my phone, thinking I might need to call the tow truck again, or maybe even call the police. But just as I reached for my phone, the truck stopped right in front of me. I froze, my hand still on the phone, unsure if I should make the call or if I was overreacting. The man leaned out of the window, his body half out of the truck, and looked right at me. "You sure you don't need help? Looks like you're stuck out here all alone. I could just give you a ride home, get you out of here." His voice had changed. It was softer now, but there was an edge to it, something cold underneath. "No, thank you," I said, forcing myself to sound firm. "I'm fine. I'm waiting for a tow. Please just go." But instead of leaving, the man did something that made my stomach drop. He got out of the truck and started walking toward my car, not fast, just slowly, like he had all the time in the world. I froze. I felt like I was being watched, studied, trapped in this moment. I didn't know what to do. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I had to think quickly. I couldn't just sit there. I started the car again, hoping it would work, praying the engine would turn over, but it didn't. Of course it didn't. My only option was to wait. But waiting felt dangerous now. I could see the man approaching the car through the side mirror, his footsteps slow, deliberate. He reached the back of my car, then circled to the front, looking down at the ground like he was inspecting it. I swallowed hard, my breath coming faster now. I didn't know what to do. I tried to think about what I had in the car. There was nothing to use for defense, nothing close enough that I could reach. The man stood by the front of my car for a moment, just staring at the hood, before he leaned down, peering through the windshield at me. He knocked on the window, gently at first. I didn't move, didn't speak. My whole body was tense, my hands gripping the steering wheel as if it could protect me. The man knocked again, this time harder. "You know," he said, his voice low, "you could at least talk to me. It's not safe out here, especially when you're so far from home. I could help you out." I didn't answer him. I just stared straight ahead, trying to make myself as small as possible, trying not to show how afraid I was. He wasn't just offering help. He wasn't leaving. He was waiting for me to make a move. He stepped back from the car, walked around to the other side, and began to check the passenger side. I could hear the crunch of gravel under his boots as he circled my car again, moving with that slow, methodical pace, like he was searching for something. I watched him through the rearview mirror, trying to calm myself, thinking about what to do next. The tow truck was supposed to be close by. Maybe I could just wait him out. But what if he didn't leave? What if he tried to get in? He came back to the driver's side again and knocked on the window. This time, I jumped. My hands were shaking now, and I could feel the panic rising. "Don't make me break that window," he said softly, like it was a casual threat. "I can see you're scared, but I'm just trying to help." I couldn't take it anymore. I knew I had to do something, but I didn't know what. I reached for my phone, but just before I could call the police, I saw headlights in the distance. The tow truck. I had never been so relieved to see anything in my life. The man saw the headlights too. He looked back at me, then back at the truck, and his expression changed. The smile faded from his face, and he took a step back. For a moment, he just stood there, watching the tow truck pull up. I didn't move, didn't take my eyes off him. The tow truck driver was a big guy, looked like someone who had seen enough strange situations to not be easily intimidated. When he got out of the truck, the man's eyes flicked between us. He stayed there for another few seconds, then turned and walked back to his truck. "Are you okay?" the tow truck driver asked, eyeing me carefully. I nodded, trying to calm my breathing. "I am now." The man got into his truck and started it up. He didn't say another word. He just backed out of the spot and drove off, disappearing into the night. I didn't stay to watch him leave. As soon as the tow truck driver finished loading my car, I got in, locked the doors, and told him to just take me home. I didn't care about anything else. I just wanted to be as far away from that man as possible. I made it home safely that night, but I still think about it sometimes. How close I came to something worse. How that man didn't just leave when I asked him to. How he just kept circling, looking for a way in. Something about him felt wrong from the start, and I'm just glad I didn't give him the chance to prove it. I worked the late shift at a cafe that stayed open until midnight, and the walk home was always the worst part of my day. Most nights it was quiet, just the usual empty streets, but I'd always feel like someone was watching me. I put it down to being tired or paranoid. I wasn't usually a nervous person, but that walk alone in the dark, it just did something to my mind. One night, close to 12:30, I left work and started my walk back. The street was completely empty, like always, just a few lights from closed shops and the occasional flickering street lamp. I put my hands in my pockets and started down the sidewalk, keeping my head down, focusing on my breathing. About halfway home, I heard something behind me, a faint echo of footsteps. At first, I thought it was just my own footsteps bouncing off the buildings. I even stopped walking, just to make sure. When I stopped, the other footsteps stopped too. That's when my stomach turned cold. I couldn't see anyone behind me, but I knew someone was there. I started walking again, a little faster this time, listening closely. After a few seconds, I heard it again, the soft shuffle of steps keeping pace with mine. I didn't look back. I told myself that it was just someone walking in the same direction, going home like me. But I felt this weight pressing down on me, like something bad was just behind my shoulder. I reached the corner, turning onto a narrow street, and dared a quick glance over my shoulder. There he was, a man, dressed in dark clothes, maybe 30 feet behind. He was walking slow, too slow for someone just heading home. It was like he was matching my speed on purpose. I turned back around, my heart hammering in my chest. I kept moving, trying to act normal, but all I could think about was him following me. My mind was racing. What if he knew I noticed him? What if that made it worse? I sped up a bit, trying to keep calm. The steps behind me got faster too, like he was keeping just close enough for me to hear him. I wanted to look back, but I was too scared to. After a few blocks, I took another turn, heading down a side street, hoping I could lose him that way. The footsteps paused for a second, then picked up again, right behind me. I felt like I was being hunted. I turned again, down an alley, the kind you'd only go through if you were desperate. The alley was dark, barely lit, with tall buildings on either side. I kept moving, praying he'd pass by or get tired of this game. But when I got halfway through, I heard the footsteps stop. I turned slowly, trying to keep my breath steady. He was there, standing at the mouth of the alley, watching me. He didn't say anything, didn't try to hide that he was staring. I could see his face now, illuminated by the faint light from a street lamp. He was a stranger, but at the same time, not. I remembered him. Weeks ago, he'd come into the cafe. He'd only ordered a coffee, stayed for maybe 10 minutes, barely talked, just sat there watching me the whole time. I'd forgotten about him until now, but now I couldn't unsee it. He took a step toward me, slow and deliberate. I backed up, my hands starting to shake. "What do you want?" I managed to choke out, my voice trembling. He didn't answer, just kept moving forward. I felt trapped, knowing the only way out was past him. I tried to keep my head up, tried to act like I wasn't scared, but I could feel the panic rising in my chest. He stopped a few feet away from me, close enough that I could smell his stale breath. His eyes were cold, focused right on me. It was like he was waiting, watching to see what I'd do next. I couldn't just stand there. I took a deep breath and forced myself to speak. "Look, I'm just trying to go home. I don't know what you want, but please, just let me go." He tilted his head, like he was considering it, but there was something in his eyes that told me he wasn't going to leave me alone. He took another step forward, and that's when I knew I had to act. Without thinking, I darted to the side, running past him as fast as I could, my feet pounding on the pavement. I could hear him behind me, running too, his steps echoing in the narrow alley. I ran faster, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I rounded the corner, back onto the main street, hoping he'd give up, hoping someone else would be around. But it was dead silent, not a single person in sight. I kept running, looking for any open door, any place I could duck into, but every shop was closed, the lights off. I could still hear his footsteps behind me, getting closer. I turned down another street, looking for any place to hide. I spotted a small alley between two buildings, barely wide enough for me to squeeze through, and darted into it. I pressed myself against the wall, holding my breath, listening as his footsteps slowed, then stopped just outside. He was close, so close I could hear him breathing. I shut my eyes, willing myself to be invisible. He stood there, just a few feet away, and I heard him mutter something under his breath. I couldn't make out the words, but it was enough to know he hadn't given up. I heard him step back onto the main street, his footsteps fading as he walked away, but I didn't move. I stayed pressed against the wall, waiting, my body tense, afraid he'd come back. When I finally dared to step out of the alley, I didn't see him anywhere. I stayed close to the buildings, moving as quietly as I could, my eyes scanning every shadow, every corner. My apartment was just a few blocks away, but those blocks felt like miles. When I finally got inside, I locked the door and slid down to the floor, my whole body shaking. I sat there in the dark for a long time, listening, waiting, afraid he'd somehow found me again. That night, I barely slept. Every sound outside, every creak, made me jump. I kept seeing his face, those eyes, the way he'd stared at me like I was some kind of prize. I don't know what he wanted, or why he was following me. But I know I'll never forget that feeling, the fear of being hunted, the way he watched me, like he already knew he'd find me again. Since then, I don't work late shifts anymore. And I never walk home alone at night. The night shift at the front desk was usually uneventful. It was a small hotel, just a handful of guests at any given time, and the lobby was empty most of the night. I'd sit at the desk, sometimes doing nothing but scrolling on my phone or reading a book to pass the time. It wasn't the kind of job that kept you on your toes. It was quiet, still. Nothing ever happened. Then, one night, I got a call around 2:30 in the morning. I remember the time exactly because I just looked at the clock, counting the hours left in my shift. The phone ringing in the dead silence of the lobby made me jump a little. I picked it up, doing my best to sound alert and professional. "Front desk, how can I help you?" There was a pause on the other end. I thought maybe it was one of the guests needing something, but all I heard was breathing. After a few seconds, I was about to hang up, assuming it was a prank, when a man's voice came on. It was low, calm, almost too calm. "I see you're reading." I froze, my heart skipping. I'd been holding my book in my lap, just flipping through pages without really paying attention. It was a small habit, something I did to stay awake. I looked around the empty lobby, wondering if maybe it was one of the guests playing a joke. But the voice, I didn't recognize it. I glanced at the monitors by the desk. There were security cameras covering most of the main areas, including the lobby, but I didn't see anyone. "Who is this?" I asked, trying to sound firm. The line went quiet again for a moment, then he spoke. "I'm just here. Watching." I stood up, the chair scraping against the floor. My skin felt prickly, like I was being watched from somewhere just out of sight. I checked the cameras again, but the lobby was empty, and all the other feeds were showing empty hallways and closed doors. I told myself it was a prank, probably one of the guests who'd seen me from a window or something. Maybe they just wanted to mess with me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. "Look," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "if this is some kind of joke, it's not funny. I'm calling security." "No, you're not," the voice said, almost in a whisper. "You're just going to keep standing there. Because you know I'm close. You know I can see you." I swallowed hard, a cold sweat starting to form on the back of my neck. I looked around again, every corner of the lobby. There was nothing, nobody, just the stillness of the night. I picked up the phone again, this time to call my manager or security, but as soon as I lifted it, the line went dead. Silence. I tried pressing some buttons, but the phone wasn't responding. It was like it had just shut down. "Don't ignore me." The voice was in the room, almost as if it was right behind me. I whipped around, but no one was there. My mind was racing, trying to figure out if I was imagining things or if someone was really there, just out of sight. I moved to the back office, where there was another phone line, hoping this one would work, but as soon as I touched the receiver, the lights in the lobby flickered, then dimmed. "Why are you hiding?" he said, his voice filling the quiet. "I can see you." I bolted out of the office, half expecting to see someone standing in the lobby, but it was empty. My legs felt shaky as I walked back to the front desk. The cameras were still on, all the screens showing empty hallways, empty rooms, nothing out of the ordinary. But it didn't make sense. I could feel him watching me, somewhere close. I grabbed my phone, about to call 911, but then my screen lit up with an unknown number. It was a text. "You don't need to call for help," it read. "I'm right here with you." I dropped the phone, my heart racing. I didn't even pick it up. I just stared at it, like it would start ringing again at any moment. And then it did. The same number. I couldn't ignore it this time. I picked it up, my hand shaking, and put it to my ear without saying anything. "You're looking a little scared," he said, his voice softer, almost mocking. "You don't have to be scared, you know. I'm just here to talk." My voice came up barely a whisper. "Who are you?" He chuckled, low and quiet. "I'm someone who knows you. Someone who's been watching you for a while now. You're very interesting." My breath was coming in short gasps now. "What do you want?" "Oh, nothing much," he said. "Just to see you." I looked at the cameras again, scanning each one carefully, looking for any sign of movement. But everything was still, as if the whole hotel was holding its breath. I didn't know what to do. I was too afraid to leave, but staying felt even worse. I decided to go into the back office again, lock the door, call the police, anything to get away from the open space of the lobby. As I moved, I could hear his voice again, this time from the speaker system. "Running away? That's not very nice." I froze. The speaker system in the lobby was playing his voice. I looked up at the small speaker mounted on the wall, feeling like his eyes were right there, watching me from some hidden place. "Don't leave, please," he said, his tone dripping with something that felt almost like sadness. "I just want to see you one last time." I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing down the hall as I dashed into the back office, slamming the door shut. I locked it and leaned against it, my whole body shaking. The phone on the desk was blinking, another incoming call. I couldn't bring myself to answer, but the ringing wouldn't stop. It just kept going, that endless sound filling the small room. I picked it up, hands trembling, and held it to my ear. "I told you, you can't hide." I dropped the phone again, backing away until I was pressed against the wall. I didn't know what to do. Every instinct told me to get out of there, but I felt trapped. He knew everything I was doing, every step I took. I grabbed my phone again, my fingers fumbling as I tried to text my manager, but before I could even type a single word, another text came through. "Open the door." I stared at the message, my hands cold. "Open the door," it said again, like he knew exactly where I was, what I was doing. "No," I whispered to myself, clutching my phone, trying to think of something, anything I could do to get out of this. I typed out a quick text to my manager, asking for help, telling him someone was in the building, but as soon as I hit send, my phone went dark. Then I heard it. Soft, slow footsteps outside the office door. The sound of someone moving, pausing, then moving again. I covered my mouth to keep from making any noise, pressing myself back against the wall, hoping he'd just leave, hoping he'd go away. The footsteps stopped right outside the door, and I could hear him breathing, the same low, steady breathing I'd heard on the phone. "I know you're in there," he whispered. "Come on out." "I'm waiting." I didn't move, didn't breathe, just kept my eyes on the door, waiting for it to burst open. But after a few seconds, the breathing stopped. Silence. I waited, straining my ears, but I didn't hear anything. Minutes passed, and still nothing. I reached for the phone on the desk, my fingers trembling as I dialed 911. The line connected, and I barely managed to whisper, "There's someone in the building. He's been watching me. Please send someone." The dispatcher assured me help was on the way, told me to stay put, stay quiet. I hung up, the phone slipping from my hand as I slumped against the wall, waiting, listening. Every sound felt magnified, every creak of the floor, every small rustle of paper. I felt trapped, caught in this nightmare that didn't seem real. After what felt like an eternity, I heard the distant sound of sirens. I stayed put until I heard the heavy footsteps of the police outside the door, calling my name. They found me there, shaking, barely able to explain what had happened. They searched the building but found nothing. No one had seen a man come or go, and all the cameras showed was me, alone, moving around the lobby, talking on the phone. But I know what I heard. I know what I felt. And even now, I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, watching, waiting for the next time I let my guard down. I worked the night shift at a parking garage downtown. Not the most exciting job, but it was decent money, and I didn't have to deal with too many people, which suited me just fine. It was mostly business types coming in and out during the day, but by night, it got pretty empty. Just a few late-night stragglers who'd forgotten where they parked, or people on their way out after a long shift. My job was to keep an eye on things, check the cameras, make sure no one was breaking into the cars. There was a small booth I worked out of on the ground floor near the entrance. Just me, a chair, a tiny desk with a monitor hooked up to the security cameras, and a vending machine that only took exact change. The garage itself had 5 floors, with dim lighting, so shadows seemed to stretch everywhere. Sound carried strangely in there, echoing down the ramps and bouncing off the concrete walls. A few months into the job, I started noticing something weird. Every now and then, I hear footsteps. At first, I'd think it was just a late-night driver heading to their car, but then I'd look at the monitor, and there'd be no one on any of the cameras. It wasn't constant, just every so often, usually in the dead quiet of the early hours when the place was completely empty. Sometimes it'd sound like they were just a floor above me, sometimes closer, like they were right around the corner. I'd hear them, pause, wait for the person to appear on one of the cameras, but no one ever did. One night, I got curious and decided to go up and check it out. I grabbed my flashlight and made my way up to the second floor. The echo of my own footsteps bounced off the walls, making the place feel twice as big and twice as empty. I walked up the ramps, my light cutting through the shadows, but I didn't see anything. It was just quiet, with the low hum of the lights buzzing overhead. Then, as I turned to head back down, I heard footsteps, soft but steady, coming from the 3rd floor above me. I froze, trying to listen, my heart pounding a little faster. They sounded slow, like someone just strolling along, not in any hurry. I took a breath and called out, "Hello? Anyone there?" My voice echoed back at me, but there was no answer. The footsteps just stopped. I waited a minute, listening, but everything was silent again. I told myself it was probably just a sound carrying from the street outside, or maybe some kind of weird echo. I shrugged it off and went back to the booth, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. After that, the footsteps became more frequent. Sometimes I'd hear them a couple of times a night, always when I was alone, always when the garage was empty. They'd start out faint, then get closer, like someone was making their way down to the ground floor. I checked the cameras, scanned the floors, but there was never anyone there. One night, around 3 a.m., it happened again. I was in the booth, half asleep, when I heard the footsteps. This time, they sounded like they were right outside the booth. I shot up, heart racing, and looked out through the glass. The garage was empty. But the footsteps were still there, moving away from me now, heading toward the back of the garage. I grabbed my flashlight, stepped outside, and shone the beam down the row of parked cars. Nothing. Is someone there? I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. There was no answer, just the echo of my own voice bouncing back at me. I stood there for a minute, feeling stupid, waiting for something to happen. But the footsteps had stopped again. The garage was silent. I decided to do a full sweep of the place, just to put my mind at ease. I walked up each level, shining my light into every corner, checking behind the pillars and parked cars. Everything was still, empty. When I got to the 5th floor, I stopped for a minute to catch my breath. The whole place was dead silent, not even a car engine humming in the distance. Then, just as I was about to head back down, I heard a voice. It was soft, like someone talking to themselves, muttering, but it echoed off the concrete, and I couldn't make out what they were saying. My stomach twisted as I slowly turned, shining my light down the rows. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. The muttering stopped. I took a few steps forward, peering around a pillar, and that's when I saw him. A man was crouched down between two parked cars, his back to me. He was wearing dark clothes, his head down, hands fidgeting with something I couldn't see. "Hey!" I called out, a bit louder this time. He didn't respond, didn't even turn to look at me. I took another step forward, keeping my flashlight on him. "What are you doing here?" He finally turned his head, just enough for me to see his face. His eyes were wide, staring at me with this intense, almost hungry look. He didn't smile, didn't blink, just looked right at me, like he was sizing me up. "I've been waiting for you," he said, his voice barely a whisper. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. "Waiting for me? What do you mean?" He didn't answer, just kept staring at me. I took a step back, my hand gripping the flashlight so tight my knuckles hurt. "You need to leave," I said, trying to sound firm. "This is private property. You can't be here." He stood up slowly, never breaking eye contact. "I've seen you here, every night," he said. "You don't know it, but I've been watching." My mouth went dry. I glanced around, half expecting to see someone else, but it was just the two of us, alone on the top floor of an empty parking garage. "Look," I said, "I don't know what you're talking about, but you need to go. Now." He took a step toward me, and I felt my heart hammering against my chest. "I know things about you," he whispered. "Things you don't even know about yourself." That was enough for me. I took another step back, turning to make a run for the stairs. But before I could move, I heard him laugh, a low, chilling sound that echoed off the walls. "You can't run from me," he said, his voice following me down the stairwell as I bolted down to the lower levels. I didn't stop until I was back at the booth, slamming the door behind me and locking it tight. I grabbed my phone and called the cops, barely able to get the words out as I told them there was a man in the garage, someone who shouldn't be there, someone who'd been following me. They said they'd send someone over right away, told me to stay in the booth and keep the door locked. I sat there, heart pounding, staring at the monitor. The camera showed all the floors, but I couldn't see him anywhere. Just empty concrete, silent and still. I kept watching, my eyes darting from screen to screen, waiting for him to appear. When the cops finally arrived, they did a full sweep of the garage, checking every floor, every corner. But they didn't find anyone. No sign of the man, no footprints, nothing. They told me he was probably just some homeless guy, someone looking for a place to sleep. But I knew it was more than that. The way he looked at me, the things he said, it felt personal. After that night, I quit. I couldn't go back to that garage, couldn't stand the thought of being there alone, listening to those footsteps, waiting for him to find me again. Even now, I sometimes feel like he's still out there, somewhere, watching, waiting. And every now and then, late at night, I swear I can hear footsteps, following me, just out of sight. I went down to Everglades National Park to spend a day kayaking on my own. I liked the feeling of being out in the wild by myself. No people, no noise, just water, trees, and whatever wildlife decided to pop up along the way. The Everglades are thick and quiet, just all green and brown stretching forever. Most people take boat tours, but I wanted to go out by myself, move slow, take it all in. I started early. The air was sticky and warm already, but that's Florida for you. I had packed light, just a small bag with water, a snack, and my phone in a plastic case, just in case I dropped it in the water. It was quiet, that kind of quiet that feels thick and heavy. You could hear every little splash or rustle. It must have been around noon when I was deep into the trails, navigating through narrow channels where the trees formed a kind of tunnel over me. I stopped to get a drink of water, letting the kayak drift, and it was then I noticed the silence had changed. It felt different. Like it wasn't just nature sounds missing, but as if something else was there, watching. I glanced around, seeing nothing but trees, water, and the trail I'd come from. No other boats, no people. I took a deep breath and pushed forward, chalking it up to nerves. But not 5 minutes later, I heard a faint splash behind me, like a paddle dipping into the water. I froze, the silence returning right after. I looked over my shoulder, half expecting to see another kayaker, maybe someone who just liked the idea of solo kayaking, too. Nothing. I didn't move at first, just let the kayak drift while I listened. The water rippled behind me, like it does when something moves. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just a gator somewhere nearby, moving around under the surface. I moved on, keeping a steady pace, but I couldn't shake the feeling. A little later, I heard it again, louder this time, a definite, rhythmic sound of paddling. It was close enough that I should have seen whoever it was, so I turned around again. The water stretched back, empty. No ripples, no kayak. Nothing. My pulse was picking up now, that jittery feeling you get when something's not quite right. I was about to call out, ask if anyone was there, maybe crack a joke if it was just someone being weird, but something stopped me. So, I kept paddling. The trail wound through tighter, denser channels, or even the light struggled to get through. But every time I ease up, listen, that sound of paddling was there, just out of sight. I tried changing up my speed, slowing down, then speeding up, trying to catch them, but every time I looked back, it was like they just disappeared. At this point, I was more than a little on edge. It didn't make sense. If someone was out here with me, I would have seen them by now. I paddled hard, hoping to leave whoever it was behind, but when I stopped again, there it was, that soft, steady splash behind me. And it was closer. This time, I spun around fast, searching for any sign, any ripple. And there it was, just a shadow, darting between trees, slipping around a bend in the water. I couldn't make them out, just the outline of a kayak, but it was enough to know I wasn't alone. I started to think I should turn back, but the thought of passing this person on the way made my stomach knot. I decided to just keep going, thinking the trail looped around eventually. The sound would fade, then come back, closer every time. The last time I heard it, it was almost right behind me. I kept glancing back, trying to catch a glimpse, but the kayak was always gone the moment I looked, like they knew the exact second I was going to turn around. I thought of yelling out, calling for help, but I wasn't sure who'd even hear me. My phone had no service, and I didn't want to stop long enough to try finding a signal. The sun was starting to sink low. I knew I didn't have much time before the light started to go. I paddled faster, my arms burning, eyes darting around for any sign of an exit. I was hoping I'd come across a ranger or another kayaker, but there was nothing, just the quiet and that steady, creeping sense of being followed. I came around a bend, and there, in the middle of the water, was another kayak. It was facing mine, dead still. I couldn't make out their face. They were wearing a white-brimmed hat pulled down low, casting a shadow. Their paddle lay across their lap, and they just sat there, waiting. I gripped my own paddle, heart hammering in my chest, wondering if they were going to say something, explain why they'd been trailing me. But they didn't move, didn't say a word, just kept their face down, hidden. Then, without a sound, they lifted their paddle and turned, slowly gliding back into the thick trees and shadows. It was like they wanted me to follow them, like they were leading me somewhere. But I stayed put, watching until their kayak disappeared around the bend, the water still behind them. I waited a few seconds before turning my own kayak and paddling in the opposite direction, faster than I ever thought I could. I didn't care if I was going the right way or not, I just wanted to get out, back to somewhere safe, anywhere with people. The sound of paddling came back again, but this time, it was moving away from me. I kept going, pushing hard, until finally, I saw the trailhead up ahead. I'd never felt such a mix of relief and terror at the same time. When I pulled up to the shore, I looked back one last time. The water was calm, no sign of anyone, like they'd never been there at all. I dragged my kayak onto land, barely stopping to catch my breath before making my way back to the car. As I loaded up, I kept scanning the trees, half expecting to see that figure standing somewhere, watching. But there was nothing, just the empty trail behind me, and the long, empty stretch of road out of the park. I had always wanted to see Yosemite at night. I'd been drawn to the idea of photographing the stars out there, hoping to catch something spectacular with my camera. So, one weekend, I packed up my gear, drove out to the park, and set up camp in a spot that I thought was far enough away from any trails or other campsites. I wanted the whole place to myself. The day passed quietly. I hiked around, took some pictures of the scenery, and scouted for a good spot to set up for the night. The plan was to stay up late and wait for the sky to clear up enough to get the kind of shot I'd only seen online. When dusk fell, I went back to camp, made some coffee to keep myself awake, and waited until it was dark enough to get started. It was around midnight when I grabbed my gear and my lantern and made my way to an open area I'd spotted earlier. It was quiet, just the sound of a light breeze and the occasional rustling in the bushes. I set up my tripod, checked my camera settings, and took a few test shots. The stars were perfect, and the air felt crisp. I felt like I was in a different world. I must have been out there for an hour, adjusting angles, trying to get the perfect shot, when I saw something in my peripheral vision. At first, I thought it was a tree or a bush casting a weird shadow, but then I noticed it was moving just barely. I turned my head slowly and saw him. There, just outside the reach of my lantern's glow, was a figure. A man, standing perfectly still, watching me. He didn't say anything, didn't move closer, just stood there, half hidden in the dark. My first thought was maybe he was another hiker, but why would he be out here in the middle of the night? And why wasn't he saying anything? I raised my hand in a half wave, more out of politeness than anything else, but he didn't respond. I looked down, fiddled with my camera, trying to shake off the weird feeling, but I couldn't concentrate. I kept glancing back, and he was still there, in the same spot, just watching. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that he'd probably move along any second, but he didn't. It was like he was waiting for something. I turned my attention back to the camera and took another shot, but my hands felt shaky. It was hard to ignore the feeling that he was still staring. I couldn't help but look over again. This time, he was closer, just a few steps closer, but still outside the light. I could barely make out his face, but he looked blank. No expression, no reaction. Just standing there. I cleared my throat and tried calling out, Can I help you with something? Nothing. Not even a twitch. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I was out there alone, in the middle of Yosemite, with this stranger who wouldn't say a word, just watching. I tried to play it cool, went back to my camera, but my hands wouldn't stop shaking. I took another photo, barely able to focus, and then checked the shot on my screen, trying to ignore the figure just behind me. When I looked up again, he'd moved even closer. This time, he was almost at the edge of the lantern's light. I could see more of him now, a dark jacket, messy hair, just the outline of his face. His eyes, though, they seemed almost empty, like he wasn't really looking at me, but right through me. I felt trapped, the quiet of the forest closing in around me. My mind raced with what to do. I wasn't near any other campers, and my car was back at the main campsite, a good 20-minute walk. I thought about just grabbing my things and leaving, but something about him kept me frozen in place. I didn't want to turn my back on him. Finally, I forced myself to speak again. "Look, man, I don't know what you want, but I'm just here to take photos. I'll be gone soon, all right?" Still nothing. He just kept staring, not moving, not reacting. It was like he was waiting for me to do something, to make the first move. Then, out of nowhere, he took one step forward, just enough that the edge of the lantern's glow caught his face. I could see his eyes clearly now, and something about them didn't seem right. They looked flat, almost lifeless. His expression was blank, like he wasn't even aware he was there, just an empty shell standing in the dark. I couldn't take it anymore. I reached down, grabbed my camera and lantern, and turned to leave. I didn't care about getting the perfect shot anymore. I just wanted to get back to camp, back to some sort of safety. I walked quickly, my footsteps loud in the silence of the night. But then I heard it. Footsteps behind me, matching my pace. I didn't want to look back, didn't want to confirm he was following, but the sound was unmistakable. Every step I took, he took too, just far enough behind me to stay out of the light. I picked up my pace, nearly tripping over my own feet as I hurried back toward the campsite. The footsteps followed, steady and slow, never rushing, just keeping pace with me, like he was in no hurry to catch up, but wanted to make sure I knew he was still there. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. I was almost to camp when I dared to look back. For a split second, I saw him, standing there at the edge of the trees, watching me. His face was still blank, his eyes dull, but his gaze felt heavy, like he was waiting for me to do something, to make some mistake. I didn't stop. I kept moving, finally reaching my tent. I zipped myself inside, gripping the lantern, listening for any sound outside. The night was dead silent, no wind, no rustling, just the sound of my own breathing. Hours passed, and eventually, the first light of dawn crept through the tent. I packed up my things as fast as I could, throwing everything into my bag, not caring if anything broke. I just needed to get out of there. As I walked back to my car, I glanced around, half expecting to see him lurking in the trees. But there was no sign of him. Just the quiet, empty forest. I've never been back to Yosemite since. I've tried to go camping in other places, but every time I set up my tent, I remember that figure standing just outside the light, watching, waiting. I don't know what he wanted, and I don't want to find out. I had always found comfort in the quiet halls of my local library. The tall shelves lined with books, the smell of old paper, and the soft rustle of pages turning created a sanctuary where I could work undisturbed. I made it a habit to spend my afternoons there, immersed in research or simply enjoying the solitude. One Tuesday, I arrived as usual, the afternoon sun spilling through the large windows, casting warm light on the polished wooden tables. I settled into my favorite corner, a small table tucked away between two tall shelves. I opened my laptop and began my work, the world outside fading away. After a while, I noticed someone out of the corner of my eye. A man sat at a table across the room, his head tilted slightly. I felt his gaze on me, heavy and unsettling. He wore a dark jacket, and his hair was unkempt. I tried to ignore him, convincing myself it was just my imagination playing tricks. I shifted my focus back to the screen, but I could not shake the feeling that he was still watching. Every time I glanced up, there he was, eyes fixed on me. I felt the tension grow in my stomach. I decided to move, thinking perhaps a change of scenery would help me concentrate. I packed my things and chose a different spot, a table near the back where the light was dimmer. I thought that might deter him, but when I looked up again, he had followed. He was at a table not too far from me, the same vacant expression on his face. I could not understand why someone would want to stare at me like that. I took a deep breath, trying to ignore the growing discomfort. I opened my book, but the words blurred on the page. I glanced at the man once more, hoping he would look away, but he remained fixed on me. I could feel my heart racing. I decided to take a break, so I stood and walked toward the restroom, hoping to clear my mind. As I passed by him, I felt a chill. He did not move his gaze from me. It was as if he were trying to memorize every detail. I hurried into the restroom, splashing cold water on my face. I tried to shake off the fear, but it clung to me. When I returned, I saw that he had moved closer, now seated at a table only a few steps away. Panic gripped me. How could he move so quietly? I glanced around the library, looking for help. The few people present were engrossed in their own worlds, oblivious to what was happening. I wanted to scream, to shout that someone was watching me, but I felt paralyzed. I decided it was time to leave. I quickly gathered my things and headed for the exit, my heart pounding in my chest. I could feel his eyes on me, almost burning into my back. The closer I got to the door, the more desperate I felt. Just as I reached the exit, I heard a soft voice behind me. "Are you leaving already?" I turned to find him standing just a few feet away. He was closer than I had expected, and I felt my breath catch. I need to go," I stammered, my mind racing. "Why don't you stay a little longer? It's nice here, isn't it?" His tone was unnervingly calm. I shook my head, backing away. "I have to go." He took a step toward me, and I could feel the adrenaline surging. I darted out of the library, the door slamming shut behind me. The cool air hit my face, and I ran to my car, fumbling with my keys. I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears, drowning out everything else. I jumped into the driver's seat, locking the doors immediately. I looked through the window, half expecting him to be right there, but he was nowhere to be seen. I breathed a sigh of relief, but the terror still clung to me. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The library faded into the distance, but I could not shake the feeling that he had been watching me long before I had noticed. I took a few deep breaths, trying to calm myself. When I finally reached home, I locked the door behind me and sat in silence for a while, trying to process what had just happened. I told myself it was probably just some strange coincidence. Maybe he was harmless, just someone with a peculiar habit. But as the hours passed, I found it hard to shake the image of his expression from my mind. That look of calm curiosity haunted me, and I could not bring myself to return to the library for days. The fear of encountering him again was too great. Eventually, I did go back, though I stayed near the front, close to the exit. I chose a table in view of the librarian, hoping to feel safer in numbers. But every time I heard footsteps behind me, my heart would race, and I would find myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see him there. Weeks passed, and I never saw him again. I tried to convince myself I was being foolish, that he had simply been an odd man who had lost interest in me. Still, the memory lingered, a shadow in the back of my mind. I continued visiting the library, but I always stayed vigilant, always aware of the world around me. I learned to trust my instincts. If something felt off, I would not hesitate to leave. That experience taught me a valuable lesson about awareness and safety. Libraries are supposed to be places of refuge, but for me, they became a reminder of how quickly comfort could turn into fear. I kept my guard up, even in places where I once felt completely at ease. I never wanted to feel that vulnerable again. I had been driving for hours, the dark road stretching endlessly before me. It was late, and I was tired. The monotony of the highway had begun to blur into the night, the lines of the road becoming indistinguishable. I decided to stop at a rest area to stretch my legs and grab a quick coffee. It was a small place, with just a few dim lights flickering overhead and a couple of vending machines lining the walls. After I parked, I stepped out of my car, taking a deep breath of the cool night air. It felt refreshing against my skin. I glanced at the empty lot. Just me and a few other cars parked nearby. I walked to the small building housing the restrooms and vending machines. The flickering lights inside cast long shadows on the floor, making it feel even more empty. I got a coffee from the vending machine and stood there for a moment, sipping it slowly, trying to shake off the fatigue. There was something eerie about the silence. It felt too quiet. I finished my coffee and walked back to my car, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the stillness of the night. As I approached, I noticed something strange. My heart dropped. Someone was sitting in the driver's seat. I froze, standing still in disbelief. The person was smiling, a wide, unsettling grin on their face, as if they belonged there. I could not see their features clearly, but the way they were looking at me sent a shiver down my spine. What the hell? I muttered to myself, confusion flooding my mind. I must have locked the car. I was certain of it. I stepped back cautiously, scanning the parking lot for anyone else. No one was around. The other cars sat silently, shadows in the dark. I tried to convince myself it was some kind of mistake, maybe a friend playing a prank. But deep down, I knew it was something more sinister. "Hey!" I shouted, trying to sound confident. "What are you doing in my car?" The person just kept smiling, their eyes fixed on me with an unsettling intensity. I felt a rush of adrenaline kick in, my instinct screaming at me to get away. I turned to head back toward the building, but something held me there. A mix of fear and curiosity pulled me back to the car. "Get out of my car!" I yelled again, taking a few cautious steps closer. My heart raced. I could not help but wonder how they had gotten in without me noticing. As I got closer, I tried to look through the tinted windows, searching for any hint of who this person was. They looked normal enough, dressed in a dark jacket and jeans, but the smile never wavered. It felt wrong. I grabbed my phone from my pocket, my hands trembling as I prepared to call for help. But before I could dial, the person suddenly leaned back in the seat, as if they were getting comfortable. "Why are you so worried?" they said, their voice smooth and calm, completely at odds with the situation. "I just wanted to talk." "Talk?" I echoed, my voice rising in disbelief. "You're in my car. Get out." The person tilted their head slightly, still smiling, as if they found the entire situation amusing. You know, it's not very nice to keep me waiting. Something inside me snapped. I could not stand there any longer, waiting for something worse to happen. I took a few steps back, ready to sprint toward the building and get help. But just as I turned, the person's voice came again, sharper this time. "Don't you want to know who I am?" I hesitated, glancing back at them. "No, I want you to leave my car. Now!" In that moment, the smile vanished. The person's expression shifted into something darker. "You really shouldn't have parked here alone," they said, the calmness replaced by an edge that sent a wave of fear coursing through me. I turned and bolted toward the rest area, adrenaline fueling my legs. I could hear them get out of my car, the sound of the door slamming shut echoing in the stillness behind me. My heart pounded in my chest as I sprinted toward the entrance, desperate to put as much distance between us as possible. I pushed through the door, rushing inside and locking it behind me. I turned to look back through the glass, my breath coming in quick bursts. I watched as the figure stood there outside, illuminated by the flickering lights, staring at me with that same unnerving smile. I reached for my phone, dialing 911 as quickly as I could. "I need help," I said, my voice trembling as I explained the situation, my eyes glued to the figure outside. They stood there, unmoving, watching me. The operator assured me help was on the way, but I could not take my eyes off the person. I thought about running out the back, escaping out of sight, but I was paralyzed with fear. What if they followed me? What if they were waiting for me to make a move? I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, a reminder of how alive I felt, yet how close I was to danger. Minutes felt like hours, and as I stood there, waiting for help to arrive, the person outside began to walk closer. Each step felt like a hammer hitting my chest. My hand shook as I gripped my phone tightly, ready to fight if I had to. Finally, I heard the distant sound of sirens, breaking the tension in the air. Relief flooded me, but I could not let my guard down yet. The figure stopped just short of the entrance, still watching me, a twisted grin on their face. It was as if they knew help was coming but did not care. They just wanted to savor the moment. When the police arrived, they stepped out of their car, and I rushed to the door, flinging it open to tell them what happened. I pointed at the figure, my voice trembling. "That person is in my car." The officers moved quickly, two of them approaching the figure while the third stayed with me, asking questions. I watched as they confronted the person, who had finally stopped smiling. The conversation was short, the officers were firm, and I could see them searching the person before leading them away. I stayed inside, unable to look away. The officers walked the person to their car, and after some time, they finally came back to me. They assured me that the individual was just a hitchhiker who had mistakenly thought my car was unoccupied and was simply looking for a ride. "Still, you did the right thing by calling us," one officer said. "It is not safe to be out here alone at night." I nodded, still shaken. I could hardly process their words. I thought about how easily things could have turned out differently if I hadn't trusted my instincts. I felt grateful to have escaped, grateful that help had come in time. As I finally returned to my car, I glanced around the parking lot, relieved to see that the figure was gone. I got inside and locked the doors, taking a moment to breathe deeply. I was exhausted, but I felt a strange sense of peace wash over me. I drove away from that rest area, the dark road ahead no longer seeming so endless. I would not be stopping for late-night breaks again. I realized how quickly the night could turn from routine to terrifying, and I knew I would remember this experience for a long time. I decided to take a weekend for myself at a bed and breakfast in a small town a few hours away. I'd booked the place because the photos online made it look cozy, like the kind of spot where you could just disconnect for a while. The house was old, one of those Victorian-style places with a big porch out front and lace curtains in the windows. When I arrived, the owner, a woman named Nora, greeted me at the door. She seemed friendly enough at first, smiling and shaking my hand like she'd known me for years. She showed me around, pointing out the dining room where breakfast would be served and the little sitting area that had a couple of armchairs and a shelf of books. She took me up to my room on the second floor. It was nice, just as the picture showed, with a big four-poster bed and a view of the garden out back. She lingered at the door after I'd set my bag down, asking if I needed anything else, then started asking where I was from and if I had come out here alone. Her tone was casual, but the questions felt strange to me, like they weren't just small talk. I told her I was here by myself for the weekend, just trying to get away from work for a bit. She nodded and said she understood, then she asked if I had family nearby, or if anyone knew where I was staying. I remember feeling a little put off by that. It wasn't the kind of thing you'd usually ask a guest, but I brushed it off, thinking she was just being curious. I answered as vaguely as I could, said something about a friend who knew where I was. She looked at me for a second, then just said she hoped I enjoyed my stay and left. That night, I was lying in bed, reading one of the books I'd picked up from the sitting area, when I heard footsteps in the hallway outside my room. At first, I thought it might just be another guest, but then I remembered I was the only one there. Nora had mentioned that earlier. The place was completely booked up the previous week, but I'd come at a slow time. The footsteps were quiet, like someone trying not to make noise, and they stopped right outside my door. I got up and walked over to the door, pressing my ear against it. I didn't hear anything else, just the faint sound of the wind outside. I almost opened it but then felt stupid for being so jumpy. I figured it was probably nothing and went back to bed, but I didn't fall asleep right away. I lay there, listening, half expecting the footsteps to start up again. The next morning, I noticed that some of my things weren't where I'd left them. I had my phone charger plugged in near the nightstand, and now it was wound up neatly and placed on the desk. I was sure I didn't do that. My suitcase, which I'd left unzipped, was now closed and buckled up. It was just little things, but they felt wrong, like someone had been in there while I was asleep. At breakfast, Nora acted completely normal, serving me coffee and chatting about the town. I kept trying to catch any hint that she knew more than she was letting on, but she just smiled and kept the conversation light. She didn't mention anything about the night before, or ask if I'd slept well, which seemed strange because that's the sort of thing you'd expect someone running a bed and breakfast to ask, right? I wanted to bring up what I heard, but I felt ridiculous. If it had been her in the hall, she'd probably just deny it, or maybe even think I was accusing her of something. The second night, I was even more on edge. I locked my door and pushed a chair in front of it just in case. It made me feel a little better, but not much. I left the lamp on and tried to distract myself with more reading, but I couldn't focus. It felt like the room was pressing in on me. I'd been listening so hard for any sound that when I finally heard a faint scraping outside the window, I jumped. It was soft at first, then got louder, like someone was brushing against the side of the house. I got out of bed and moved slowly toward the window. I didn't see anyone, but I noticed that one of the shutters was open. I was almost sure they'd both been closed when I come up to the room earlier. I backed away and went back to the chair I'd propped against the door, just standing there, not sure what to do. It was like I was waiting for something, but I didn't know what. Eventually, I did fall asleep, but it wasn't restful. I kept waking up, feeling like I'd heard something but not being sure if I dreamed it. When morning came, I felt more exhausted than I had before I'd come on this so-called getaway. I started packing up to leave. As I was zipping up my suitcase, I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. My toothbrush, which had been on the sink the night before, was now in my bag. It was wrapped in a small plastic bag that wasn't mine. I hadn't touched it since I'd arrived. I went downstairs to check out, and Nora was there, smiling as always. I tried to keep my voice steady as I asked if she'd come into my room at all during my stay. Her smile faded just a little, and there was a quick flash of something in her eyes, annoyance, maybe, or recognition, but it was gone so fast I couldn't be sure. She told me she'd had no reason to go up there and asked if everything was all right. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded and handed her the payment. I was almost out the door when she said, "You left your window unlocked last night, you know." I froze and turned to look at her. There was something in the way she said it, like she knew it would get under my skin. I hadn't told her about the shutter being open. I hadn't even mentioned the window. I forced a smile and told her thanks, then hurried out to my car. As I pulled out of the driveway, I glanced back at the house and saw her standing on the porch, watching me go. She had that same smile, but there was something different about it now, like it was more for her than for me. I drove straight home and didn't stop until I was well out of that town. For the rest of the drive, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something I hadn't noticed while I was there, something she'd done or said that I'd missed. I kept going over every little detail in my head, wondering what could have happened if I hadn't left when I did. I'm not sure what her deal was or what she was trying to do, but I've never stayed at a bed and breakfast again. There's just something about staying in a stranger's house that doesn't sit right with me anymore. I had always liked small-town fairs. There's something about the smell of fried food, the bright lights, and the noise of the crowds that makes you feel like a kid again. This year, I was traveling for work, and I found myself in one of those towns that barely shows up on a map. It just so happened they were having their annual fair, and since I didn't have much else to do, I decided to check it out. The fairgrounds were on the edge of town, a big open field with a few rides, game booths, and a stage where a local band was playing. It wasn't as flashy as the big city fairs, but it had its own charm. There were families with kids running around, couples holding hands, and groups of teenagers laughing and shoving each other near the bumper cars. I bought a ticket at the gate and wandered in, figuring I'd grab something to eat and maybe try a few games. As I walked past a booth where a man was calling out for people to win a stuffed bear, I noticed him. A man standing off to the side, just outside the main crowd. He wasn't doing anything, just watching. His face was pale, almost sickly, and he wore a long coat that seemed too heavy for the warm night. His eyes were fixed on me. It was the kind of stare that makes you uncomfortable, like he knew something about me that I didn't. I shrugged it off, telling myself he was probably just some guy zoning out, and went to get a corn dog. I spent the next hour or so wandering around the fair, trying out some of the games and watching the rides. I even went on the Ferris wheel, which gave me a good view of the whole place. It was nice, peaceful even. But every now and then, I caught sight of that man again. He wasn't close, but he was there. Always just far enough away that I couldn't really make out his face, but I knew it was him. The coat, the way he stood, arms hanging at his sides. Watching. It started to get to me after a while. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was following me. I told myself it was just paranoia, that it was a small fair and it made sense to see the same people more than once. But as the night went on, it got harder to ignore. Every time I turned around, he was there. Not saying anything, not getting closer. Just standing still, staring. I tried to lose myself in the crowd, moving between rides and booths, but no matter where I went, he was there. I tried going into the funhouse, figuring the mirrors and dark corners would throw him off. But when I came out, he was waiting near the exit, standing next to a group of teenagers who seemed completely unaware of him. I started to get this tight feeling in my chest, like the walls were closing in. It wasn't crowded anymore. Families were heading home, and the groups of teenagers had thinned out. The fair was winding down, and most people were near the stage, watching the band. The farther I got from the main area, the quieter it got, until it was just me and the hum of the rides in the distance. That's when I saw him again, only this time, he wasn't just watching. He was moving toward me. I stopped walking, my heart pounding. He was coming straight for me, his hands shoved into the pockets of his coat. His face was still hard to make out in the dim light, but I could see enough. His eyes were locked on me, his mouth set in a grim line. I turned and walked quickly in the opposite direction, trying to keep my pace steady. I didn't want to run, not yet, not until I was sure. But I could hear him behind me, his footsteps crunching in the dirt, getting faster. I glanced over my shoulder, and that's when I knew. He was running. I broke into a sprint, dodging between the booths and trying to head back toward the entrance. But the lights from the fair seemed farther away now, like the whole place had shifted while I wasn't looking. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like they were moving through water. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get away. I turned a corner and found myself in a part of the fairground that hadn't been set up with booths or rides. It was just empty space, dark and quiet. My breath was coming in ragged gasps, and I slowed down, trying to listen. I couldn't hear his footsteps anymore, but I knew he was close. I looked around, trying to find a way out, but there was nothing. Just shadows and silence. Then I heard it, soft at first, like the wind moving through the grass. But it wasn't the wind. It was his voice. "You shouldn't have come here." The words were low, almost a whisper, but they sent a chill down my spine. I didn't know where he was, but he was close. Too close. I started backing up, my eyes scanning the darkness, trying to find him. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. He was standing just a few feet away, half hidden in the shadows. His face was twisted in a sneer, and his eyes were wild. "I just want to go," I said, my voice shaking. "I don't want any trouble." He didn't answer, just took a step toward me. I stumbled back, my hands shaking, and nearly fell. I had to get out of there, but every direction I looked seemed like a dead end. The fair was just a distant blur of lights now, too far away. He took another step, then another. His hands came out of his pockets, and I saw the glint of something metal in the dim light. A knife. I didn't think. I just ran. I don't know how long I ran for, but it felt like hours. My legs were burning, my lungs felt like they were going to burst, but I kept going. I could hear him behind me, his footsteps pounding the ground, getting closer. I rounded a corner and saw the lights of the fair again, the sound of the band echoing in the distance. I wasn't far now, but my legs felt like lead. I pushed myself harder, ignoring the pain, ignoring the fear. I had to make it. I burst out of the dark, back into the main area of the fair. There were still people around, still enough light and noise to make me feel like I had a chance. I kept running, not stopping until I reached the entrance. The ticket booth was empty now, and the gates were wide open. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know if he was still behind me. I got to my car, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the keys out of my pocket. I fumbled with the lock, glancing over my shoulder every few seconds, half expecting him to appear out of the darkness. But he didn't. I got in, started the engine, and drove. I didn't stop until I was miles away, the lights of the fair lawn behind me. I don't know who he was or what he wanted. Maybe he was just some local who didn't like outsiders, or maybe he was something worse. But I didn't care. I was safe now, and that was all that mattered. But I'll never forget the look in his eyes, or the way he whispered those words, like he was daring me to run. Like he knew I wouldn't make it out. It was a Saturday morning in late September when I decided to hike in Acadia National Park. I had been feeling overwhelmed lately, and the thought of fresh air and the beauty of nature was just what I needed. I packed my backpack with water, some snacks, and my camera. I arrived at the park early, hoping to beat the crowds. The weather was perfect, crisp but not too cold, with a clear blue sky above. The trail I chose was a lesser-known one, winding through dense woods and offering stunning views of the coast. I loved the quiet, the sound of leaves crunching underfoot, and the distant calls of birds. As I walked, I took pictures of the trees and the occasional glimpse of the ocean through the branches. I felt light and free, the weight of my worries lifting with every step. After an hour or so, I rounded a bend and came to a clearing. The sunlight poured in, illuminating the path ahead. I stopped for a moment to catch my breath and take in the view when I noticed a figure in the distance. A man was standing a little off the trail, just inside the tree line. He was looking directly at me. I squinted, trying to see him better. He seemed to be in his late 40s, dressed in hiking gear, but something about him made me uneasy. I considered turning back, but I didn't want to seem rude. I lifted my hand in a tentative wave, but he didn't wave back. Instead, he stepped forward, out of the trees, and onto the trail. "I've been waiting for you," he said, his voice steady and calm. I felt a chill run through me. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. He took a step closer. "I know you. I've been waiting for you to come here." I forced a smile, thinking he must be joking. "I'm sorry, but I don't think we've met." His expression didn't change. "No, not like that. I know you. I know things about you." I took a step back, feeling the weight of his gaze on me. "Listen, I really need to keep hiking," I said, trying to brush him off. I turned to move past him, but he stepped in front of me, blocking my way. "Wait," he said, his voice more urgent now. "You don't understand. You're not safe out here." "What do you mean?" My heart raced. The woods felt suddenly too quiet, and I could hear my pulse in my ears. "I know you're alone." "You shouldn't be alone," he insisted. "I can help you. You need to trust me." "I don't even know you," I said, my voice shaking a little. "I just want to hike in peace." He took another step closer, and I felt a wave of fear wash over me. "You have to listen. I know things about your life. Things you haven't told anyone." I stared at him, searching for some hint of honesty in his face. "How do you know anything about me?" He smiled then, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I just do. I've been watching you. You need to listen to me. I can protect you." The weight of his words settled around me like a fog. My instinct screamed at me to get away. I took another step back. "I'm sorry, but I really have to go." He moved again, stepping into my path, blocking my way. "I won't let you leave. You don't understand. There are things out here. People who will hurt you. I can help you. Just let me show you." My heart raced. I felt trapped. The forest around us was still, and I could sense the danger radiating off him. "You're scaring me," I said, trying to sound firm, but I could hear the tremor in my voice. "Don't be scared," he said, his voice suddenly softening. "I'm here to help. I've been waiting for you to notice me. You need to trust me. I know you are going through things, and I can help." The way he spoke sent shivers down my spine. I felt like a deer caught in headlights. My mind raced through my options. I could try to push past him, but he was taller and more solid than I was. I could scream, but who would hear me? "I really have to go now," I said, my voice firmer. I glanced to my right, looking for an opening, any way to escape. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my panic at bay. "You are not listening," he said, raising his voice. "I'm telling you that I can help you. You don't have to do this alone." Before I could think, I ducked to the left and ran. I didn't look back. I could hear him call out after me, but I kept moving, pushing myself to go faster. The trail narrowed, and branches scratched at my arms as I ran, but I didn't care. I had to get away. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath coming in quick bursts. I could still hear him behind me, but I didn't dare look back. I focused on the trail ahead, willing myself to keep going. I could see the trees thinning in the distance. The sound of his footsteps faded slightly, but I could not let my guard down. I stumbled but caught myself. I was close to the clearing where I had first seen him. I thought of all the people who might be around, the cars in the parking lot, the park rangers. I needed to reach them. As I burst into the clearing, I didn't stop. I kept running until I reached the edge of the trail, where it met the parking area. My heart was racing, and I could see my car in the distance, just a little farther now. I finally reached my car, fumbled with the keys, and jumped inside. I locked the doors and took a moment to collect myself, glancing around for any sign of him. After a moment, I spotted him standing at the edge of the woods, just beyond the clearing. He was watching me, a shadow among the trees. I could see that unsettling smile on his face again. I felt the panic rise in my chest, but I quickly started the engine and pulled out of the lot, not looking back. I drove away as fast as I could, adrenaline surging through me. I felt shaky and relieved all at once. I had escaped. I had gotten away. I never returned to that trail. The memory of his words haunted me for weeks, but I learned to be more careful. I realized that sometimes the most innocent places can hold the most danger. I had always been drawn to the outdoors. Hiking, camping, and being surrounded by nature was my escape from the busy life back home. When I finally got the chance to visit Great Basin National Park, I felt like I was stepping into paradise. The vastness of the night sky and the rugged mountains were mesmerizing. I planned a night hike, wanting to experience the park under the stars. The sun set slowly, and I started my hike just as twilight settled in. I had a flashlight strapped to my waist, and the beam of light flickered against the trees, illuminating my path. As I walked, the sounds of the night surrounded me, the rustling of leaves, the distant chirping of crickets, and the occasional call of an owl. It felt peaceful, almost magical, but something in the air felt heavy, as if the night was holding its breath. After hiking for about an hour, I reached a clearing with a view of the stars. I stopped to take it all in, the vastness of the universe stretching above me. I pulled out my phone to take a picture when I noticed a movement on one of the nearby rock outcroppings. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but there it was again, a figure, waving at me. I squinted into the darkness, trying to see more clearly. The figure was standing on the rock, silhouetted against the night sky. They raised their arm again, a slow and deliberate wave, as if they were beckoning me over. My heart raced with excitement and curiosity. I had heard that it was common for hikers to encounter other people out in the wilderness, especially on popular trails like this one. I assumed this person might have a similar interest in the stars or was simply enjoying the solitude of the night. "Hello!" I called out, raising my hand in response. "Is everything okay?" The figure continued to wave, but I noticed something odd. They were not moving from that spot. No steps were taken toward me. The way they waved felt almost mechanical, like they were waiting for me to approach. A chill ran down my spine. Despite the unease creeping in, I felt compelled to investigate. I started walking towards the outcropping, careful with each step. The ground was rocky and uneven, and I felt a mix of excitement and dread. As I got closer, I called out again, "Hey, are you all right?" The figure was now barely visible. The moment I stepped onto the outcropping, I realized there was no one there. I stood frozen, scanning the area for any sign of movement. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, the thrill of the unknown turning into something darker. The air felt thicker, and I felt like I was being watched. Then I noticed the ground beneath me. The dirt was freshly disturbed, as if someone had been standing right there just moments before. There were footprints leading away from the rock, but they were erratic and scattered, like whoever had been there had moved quickly and in a panic. My breath quickened as I crouched down to examine the area more closely. The footprints were not from a hiker's boots. They were bare and left a clear imprint in the soil, leading deeper into the darkness. I glanced back at the path I had come from. It felt like a lifetime away, and the way back suddenly seemed daunting. I had always felt comfortable in nature, but now it felt like a trap. A cold wind swept through the trees, sending a shiver down my spine. I stood up, a deep sense of fear washing over me. I had to leave. I turned around, planning to retrace my steps, but I hesitated. I could not shake the feeling that I was not alone. I quickly made my way back to the trail, glancing over my shoulder. The darkness felt alive, as if it were watching me. I moved faster, adrenaline pushing me forward, and I tried to rationalize what I had seen. Maybe it was just someone playing a prank or perhaps a hiker who had lost their way. But something deep inside me knew that this was different. The shadows around me felt longer, darker. I picked up my pace, my breathing coming in sharp bursts as I hurried down the trail. Every rustle of the leaves and snap of a twig made me jump. The more I hurried, the more the fear grew. I wanted to believe I was just overreacting, but it felt too real. When I finally reached my car, I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking. I glanced around, expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows, but the area was quiet. I threw my gear in the back seat and locked the doors as soon as I was inside. I sat there for a moment, heart racing, trying to calm myself. I looked back at the trail, the darkness swallowing it up, and I felt a sense of relief wash over me. As I drove away, I could not shake the feeling that I had escaped something sinister. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, but I knew what I had seen. The figure waving, the disturbed earth, and the footprints leading into the night haunted me as I left the park. I would never forget the feeling of being watched, the quiet tension of the night, and the strange, unsettling encounter that pushed me to the edge. Great Basin National Park was meant to be a refuge, a place of beauty, but it turned into a nightmare I would carry with me long after I left. I promised myself I would never hike alone at night again, knowing that the wilderness can hold more than just nature. It can hold secrets that are best left undisturbed. I have always loved camping, especially alone. There is something freeing about being out in the wilderness, away from all the noise and distractions of everyday life. I decided to spend a weekend at Big Bend National Park, a place known for its beauty and solitude. I had my tent set up, and the vastness of the stars above was stunning. The peace of the night surrounded me as I settled in with a book, the flickering light of my lantern casting shadows around the campsite. As the hours passed, I started to hear sounds in the distance. At first, it was just the rustling of leaves, the sounds of the night. Then I heard laughter. It was faint but unmistakable, and it made me sit up in my sleeping bag. I listened closely, trying to determine where it was coming from. The laughter grew louder, mixed with voices, and it seemed to be coming from a nearby area. A knot formed in my stomach, and I felt a strange mix of curiosity and caution. It was late, but I felt compelled to investigate. I grabbed my flashlight, trying to push away the unease creeping in. I had been told that this park was safe, that the people who ventured here were usually friendly. I slipped out of my tent and walked towards the sounds, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the dark. The laughter guided me to a clearing not far from my camp. There, I found a group of people gathered around a bonfire, the flames dancing high and casting a warm glow on their faces. They were laughing and talking, their voices ringing out in the stillness of the night. I felt a bit relieved but also on edge. I was not expecting to find others this far out. As I approached, they noticed me and turned their heads. Their smiles were wide, and they waved me over. "Hey there. Come join us," one of them called out. I felt a mixture of warmth and wariness. They seemed inviting, but something about the way they looked at me made me hesitate. I stepped closer, trying to read the situation. The group was a mix of men and women, all looking to be in their 20s or 30s. They wore casual clothes, and their laughter seemed genuine. I was almost ready to sit down when I noticed how their eyes kept drifting towards my backpack. It was resting against a nearby rock, my only source of food and water for the night. "Nice backpack you got there," another person said, a grin stretching across his face. I forced a smile, trying to keep the mood light. "Thanks. Just some supplies for the night." They nodded, but the way they kept glancing at it made my skin crawl. I tried to change the subject. "What brings you all out here?" "We come out here often," a woman replied, her voice cheerful. "Just to get away from everything, you know? The stars are incredible here." "Yeah," I said, trying to sound enthusiastic. "I love the stars." But as I spoke, I noticed their smiles didn't quite reach their eyes. It was as if they were playing a part, and I was the audience. They invited me to sit by the fire, and I felt compelled to join them, despite my instincts telling me to leave. As I settled onto a log, the warmth of the flames enveloped me, and I felt a bit more at ease. But that feeling quickly faded as they resumed their conversation, laughter ringing out with an edge I could not place. "Hey, you should show us what's in your backpack," one of the men suggested suddenly. His tone was playful, but there was a seriousness behind it that made my heart race. I forced a laugh, feeling the tension rise in my chest. "Oh, it's just some food and a few supplies. Nothing special. Come on, we're all friends here." "Let's see it," he pressed, leaning forward, his gaze intense. I glanced at the others, and they all nodded, their eyes eager. A wave of unease washed over me. Something was off. This wasn't just friendly curiosity. "I really need to keep it safe," I said, my voice steady despite the fear building inside me. "It's important to me." The group exchanged glances, and I could feel the mood shift, their previous warmth fading into something colder. "Important, huh?" another man said, his voice low. "What's so important that you can't share it with friends?" I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I forced myself to smile, but inside, I was panicking. Just some personal items. I promise it's nothing interesting. The laughter stopped. The fire crackled, and silence enveloped us. I could feel the weight of their stares, assessing, waiting. I needed to leave. I should really get back to my campsite, I said, standing up abruptly. The group shifted, and the tension in the air became palpable. Thank you for the invitation, but Before I could finish, one of the women stood up as well. Wait. Don't go just yet. We were having such a nice time. Her smile was tight, and it felt forced. I turned, my heart pounding, and took a few steps back. I really need to go, I said firmly, trying to keep my voice steady. Suddenly, the man who had first spoken stepped closer. Come on, don't be rude. Just share with us. We only want to have a good time. I could sense the shift in their demeanor, the way they surrounded me like wolves closing in on prey. I took another step back, feeling the fear rise inside me like a wave. Please, I said, trying to keep my voice calm. I just want to go back. They paused, and for a moment, it seemed like they were reconsidering. Then the woman said, "Why don't you just let us take a look? We can help you with whatever is in there." I turned and ran. The laughter from behind me turned into shouts as I bolted into the darkness. I didn't look back, my heart pounding in my chest. I felt the fear propelling me forward, guiding my steps as I raced back towards my campsite. I stumbled through the trees, branches clawing at my arms, the night closing in around me. The path felt endless, and I could hear their voices behind me, but I didn't dare to stop. I burst through the clearing where my tent was set up, my breath coming in gasps. I quickly unzipped my tent and threw myself inside, zipping it up tightly behind me. I grabbed my phone, the only source of light I had left, and I huddled in the corner, trying to calm my racing heart. The laughter and voices from the bonfire faded into the night, but I did not dare to relax. I spent the rest of the night listening, waiting for any sign that they had followed me. When morning finally came, I emerged from my tent, the sun casting a warm glow over the park. I was shaken but relieved to see that the group was gone. I quickly packed my things, feeling the need to leave this place behind. As I drove away from Big Bend, the beautiful landscape blurred through the window. The adventure I had sought had turned into a nightmare. I vowed to be more cautious in the future, to trust my instincts. The wilderness was not just a beautiful escape, it could also hold dangers I never imagined. I left with a heavy heart, knowing that the night had changed something inside me forever. I was on night shift for a construction job at an old hotel. The place had been shut down for years, long before I even came to town. We'd been called in to strip it down before it got fully renovated, but this place had been through a lot. Windows boarded up, walls cracked and peeling, whole floors that hadn't seen the light of day in decades. It was just me on site most nights, just moving rubble, stripping paint, getting things ready for the crew in the morning. On that particular night, I just finished hauling some debris down to the basement when I heard it. Someone called my name. It wasn't loud, but it was clear as anything. "Jack," it said, just like that, like someone standing right behind me. I turned fast, expecting to see one of the guys. I knew I was the only one there, but in a place like that, sound carried weirdly. I didn't see anyone, of course. Just dark, empty hallways leading off in both directions. I brushed it off, thought maybe it was the wind or something. The place had been rotting from the inside out for decades, wind whistling through gaps in the walls, all that. I went back to my work, trying not to think about how my name had sounded, almost like a whisper, right in my ear. I'd barely picked up my tools when I heard it again, a little louder this time. Jack. I stood there, just listening. It was like whoever it was had moved a little further down the hall. It made me think maybe someone was messing with me. One of the guys from the morning crew could have stayed late to pull a prank or something, hiding in the shadows. It wasn't a bad place for it, plenty of dark corners and empty rooms. But as I went to call out, my voice echoed down the hall, unanswered. My skin started to crawl a little, but I tried to keep working. After all, this wasn't the first weird thing I'd experienced working late nights alone in an old building. I get paid, finish my job, and get the hell out. But every so often, just when I thought I was safe, I hear it again, the voice calling my name from different spots in the building. Once it sounded like it was coming from the second floor, then down the hall. It was like someone was following me but staying just out of reach, making sure I knew they were there. I decided I'd had enough. I went back to the main hall to gather up my tools and get out. But when I got there, my toolbox was gone. Now, I know I'd left it by the staircase I'd used to hammer just 10 minutes before. But the whole box had disappeared, like someone had snatched it up the second I turned my back. I looked around, feeling the hairs on my neck start to stand up. It's one thing to hear a voice, to think you're maybe imagining it, but your tools? Those don't just vanish on their own. I walked back to the basement, figuring maybe I'd put it down without realizing. Sure enough, when I got to the basement, there it was, sitting in the middle of the room, like it had been waiting for me. Tools scattered out, just lying there like someone had gone through them. I didn't touch it. Just stood there, staring at it, trying to wrap my head around what was happening. I wanted to leave right then, but I still had to pack up my tools and lock up. I reached down, started tossing everything back into the box, and that's when I heard my name again, closer this time. Jack. Just a whisper, but it made my skin go cold. I grabbed my toolbox and headed up the stairs, fast as I could. I was done playing games with whatever was in there. As I got to the main hall, though, I saw something that made me stop dead in my tracks. My ladder had been moved. I'd left it leaning against the wall by the stairwell, but now it was in the middle of the hall, lying flat, blocking my way to the door. I walked over and dragged it aside, my hand shaking as I shoved it against the wall. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, that maybe I'd moved it and forgot. But that didn't explain the voice, or the toolbox, or how the ladder ended up blocking my path. I was just about to reach the door when I heard it again, right by my ear. Jack. This time, it was louder, clear enough to make me jump. I turned around, expecting to see someone right there, but the hall was empty. I could feel my heart hammering as I scanned the shadows, half expecting something to jump out at me. I ran for the door, wrenching it open, but as I stepped out into the night air, I felt like I was leaving something behind. Like I was being watched from the shadows, someone just waiting for me to come back. The next morning, I told the site manager what happened. He just laughed, said I was probably just tired, that maybe the place was getting to me. But I know what I heard, and I know what I saw. I never took the night shift again. I wasn't going back into that building, not after that. I worked at a late-night customer service center. My job involved answering calls from customers who needed help with their accounts. It was mostly uneventful, just me and the glow of the computer screen and the hum of the phones. My shift started at 11 o'clock and ended at 7 in the morning. The hours were quiet, aside from the occasional call from a confused customer. At first, the routine felt comforting. I had my cup of coffee, the sound of typing as I entered data, and the stillness of the night surrounding me. I could always hear the other operators in the background, their voices blending into the soft buzz of the room. But then, things started to change. It began with a call that came in around midnight. The voice on the other end was deep and grating. He asked me a question about his account, but it was the way he spoke that set off alarms in my head. There was something off, something that made my skin crawl. "You sound tired," he said, as if he had been watching me. "Working all night again?" I felt a chill run through me. I had not shared my schedule with anyone outside of work. I brushed it off, thinking it was just a prank. I answered his questions, and when he hung up, I felt relief wash over me. But that relief was short-lived. The calls kept coming. Every time I answered, it was the same voice. He would ask about random things, always knowing when I was alone and when I had my coworkers nearby. "Did you see that new desk they set up in the break room?" he asked one night. "It looks comfortable. You should sit there more often." I felt the blood drain from my face. How could he know these details? At first, I considered the possibility that it might be one of my coworkers playing a prank. I laughed it off, but the laughter died in my throat when he continued to call. "What time does Brenda leave?" I heard she might be gone for good. I hung up, my heart racing. I hadn't mentioned anything about Brenda to anyone, let alone to a stranger on the phone. The next week, it escalated. I was alone in the office when the phone rang. I glanced at the clock. It was 2:30 a.m. I picked up. "How are you, Sarah?" he asked. My breath caught in my throat. "Who is this?" I demanded. "Why do you keep calling me?" He chuckled, a low, unsettling sound. "I just wanted to know if you liked the sandwich from the deli around the corner." I dropped the phone into my lap, heart pounding. How did he know I had gone there on my break? It was the only place open that late. I felt trapped, exposed, as if he had eyes everywhere. The next night, I decided I would not let him scare me. I told my coworkers about the calls, thinking it would help to have someone know. They laughed it off, saying it was just a prank, that I should ignore it. But it was hard to ignore when he called me at the same time every night, each time with a new detail about my life that made me question my safety. "How did you like the new hair color?" he asked one night, catching me completely off guard. I had dyed my hair only a couple of days before. I felt paranoid. I started looking over my shoulder, listening intently to every sound in the office. I stopped taking my breaks outside. I would sit in the break room, staring at my phone, hoping it would not ring. My coworkers noticed I was on edge, and they asked what was wrong, but I did not want to scare them. I thought maybe I was being dramatic. One night, the atmosphere shifted. It was just after 3 a.m., and I was the only one in the office. My heart raced as I answered yet another call from him. "I see you," he said, his voice smooth and low. "You're all alone, aren't you?" I slammed the phone down, my hands trembling. I wanted to scream, to run out of the office, but I was paralyzed by fear. I glanced around the darkened office, the shadows playing tricks on my mind. My eyes darted to the windows, the hallway leading to the exit, and back to my computer screen. The air felt thick, heavy with dread. I could hear my heartbeat thundering in my ears. I sat frozen, the thought of leaving filling me with terror. Then, the phone rang again. My hand shook as I reached for it. "I'm coming to see you," he said. The line went dead before I could respond. I sprang into action, grabbing my bag and bolting for the exit. I glanced back at the empty office, the phone silent now, my heart racing as I pushed through the door. I rushed to my car, my breath coming in quick gasps. I glanced around the parking lot, my heart pounding. What if he was watching? As I fumbled with my keys, I heard footsteps behind me. I spun around, ready to scream, but it was just a passing car, its headlights cutting through the darkness. I breathed a sigh of relief, but it was short-lived. I jumped into my car, locked the doors, and drove away, not looking back. I called my boss the next day and told him everything. I asked him to check the security footage from the night before. He agreed and told me to stay home until he figured it out. When I returned to work days later, my boss pulled me aside. "We didn't see anyone," he said. "No one came in. It looks like you were alone." I felt a shiver run through me. "Are you sure?" He nodded. "We will keep a closer watch on the cameras. You just need to let us know if it happens again." I tried to breathe, to calm my nerves. But the sense of dread never truly left me. After a week, I resumed my shifts. The calls stopped coming. I didn't know if he had moved on or if he was just waiting for the right moment. Each night I worked, I kept my guard up, my heart racing at the slightest noise. I looked over my shoulder, expecting to see him lurking in the shadows. The fear faded slowly, replaced by a tentative sense of normalcy. I learned to keep my phone close, to be aware of my surroundings. I never felt completely safe, but I kept working, hoping the worst was over. Then, one night, I heard a familiar voice. It was the same deep, grating tone. "Sarah," it called softly. I froze, feeling ice fill my veins. I glanced at the phone, terror gripping me. My heart pounded in my chest as I fought the urge to answer. I decided then that I would not let fear control my life. I picked up the phone. "Who are you?" I demanded, voice steady. But there was silence on the other end, and the call dropped. My hand shook as I set the phone down. I had stood my ground, but the fight was far from over. I would keep my eyes open, keep my heart ready. I would not let him win. I worked a graveyard shift at a 24-hour convenience store, just me, the buzzing lights, and that ticking clock. It was the kind of job where nothing really happened, just quiet hours with the occasional late-night shopper. People would shuffle in, grab a drink or snack, maybe some smokes, then leave. And I was fine with that. I liked the quiet. But then he started showing up. It was sometime in early September. I remember that night because the air felt heavy, like it might rain. He was just standing across the street, right by the old lamppost that flickered on and off. I noticed him, thought maybe he was waiting for a ride or something, but he just stayed there. No movement, no one else around. At first, I tried not to think too much of it. I kept myself busy, stocked the shelves, cleaned the counter, anything to pass the time. But every time I looked up, he was still there, just staring. It's like he was waiting for something. The next night, he was there again, in the same spot, same stance, arms crossed. He was tall, maybe in his late 30s or 40s, with a bit of a scruffy look. He wore a dark jacket and jeans, nothing that really stood out, but the way he watched, it wasn't normal. I could feel it, that prickle on the back of my neck. I kept telling myself maybe he was just some guy who lived nearby, maybe waiting for someone. But he never crossed the street, never came inside. He didn't come every night, just enough that I started to expect it. Sometimes it'd be 2 nights in a row, then he'd skip a day, then back again. It made me uneasy, but I couldn't really do anything about it. He wasn't breaking any laws by just standing there. Then, one night, about a week later, he finally came inside. It was around 2 in the morning. The store was empty, like usual, just me and the hum of the freezers in the back. I was restocking the drink fridge when I heard the bell over the door. I looked up, and there he was, stepping in. He didn't look at me right away, just walked down the first aisle, his hands tucked in his jacket pockets. I tried to act normal, just went back to stocking the shelves, but I could feel him watching me from the corner of his eye as he walked slowly through the store. He wasn't looking at the products or grabbing anything, just lingering, one aisle at a time. I kept telling myself not to freak out, that maybe he was finally here to buy something, that it was all just in my head. But then he turned down my aisle, just a few feet away, and stopped. He looked at me, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. His gaze was intense, like he was looking right through me. "Hi, Claire," he said. I froze. I hadn't told him my name. I was sure of that. I didn't wear a name tag or anything. There was no way he could have known. My mind raced, trying to think if I'd slipped up somehow, but I knew I hadn't. I forced a smile, tried to play it cool. "Can I help you with something?" He didn't answer right away, just kept staring. Then he tilted his head, almost like he was sizing me up. "You're here alone, aren't you?" he said, like he was making small talk, but his voice was low, calm. Too calm. Something about the way he said it made my stomach twist. I didn't want him to know I was alone. I cleared my throat, shrugged. "Not always," I said, hoping it sounded believable. "My manager comes in around 3. He just smiled, a thin, tight smile. "I know you're here alone, Claire," he said, his voice steady, almost amused. I wanted to scream or run, but I forced myself to stay calm. I was in my own store, with cameras watching. I kept my voice even, trying to sound unfazed. "Look, if you don't need anything, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." He took a step closer, too close for comfort, and I could feel my heart racing. "You shouldn't be working here by yourself," he said, like he was giving me advice, like he was concerned for me. "It's dangerous, especially at night." I backed up a little, moving towards the counter where I had a phone under the register. I glanced over at it, hoping he didn't notice, but he did. I could see it in his eyes. He knew exactly what I was thinking. "Don't worry," he said, a bit of a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I'm not here to hurt you. Just wanted to see you up close." His words made my skin crawl. I tried to think of what to say, something that would get him to leave, but my mind was blank. All I could do was stare at him, my throat dry, my hands shaking. Finally, he stepped back, giving me a little space, but he didn't turn to leave. "I'll see you around, Claire," he said, like he was making a promise. Then he walked out, as calm as he'd come in, and disappeared into the night. I stood there for a long time, heart pounding, trying to process what had just happened. I didn't know what to do. I thought about calling the police, but what would I say? That a man came into the store and acted strange? They wouldn't take me seriously. After that, I kept an eye out for him every night, just waiting for him to come back. And he did. Sometimes he'd just stand outside, watching. Other nights, he'd come in, wander around without buying anything, then leave. And every time he'd call me by name. I started dreading my shifts. I didn't feel safe anymore. I tried telling my boss, but he just shrugged it off, said I was overreacting. People are weird sometimes, he told me, like that was supposed to make me feel better. One night, when I couldn't take it anymore, I confronted him. He'd come in, lingered around as usual, and I just snapped. "Why do you keep coming here?" I asked, my voice shaking. "What do you want?" He looked at me, that same unsettling smile on his face. "I just like seeing you," he said, his voice soft. "I feel like we know each other." We don't, I said, my voice firm. Stop coming here. His smile faded, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something else in his eyes. Anger, maybe. He took a step closer, and I could feel the tension in the air. Careful, Claire, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. You don't want to make me angry. I didn't know what to say, so I just stayed silent, watching as he finally turned and left. That was the last time I saw him. I don't know why he stopped coming after that. Maybe he found someone else to follow, someone else to watch. I quit the job not long after that. I couldn't stay there, not knowing if he'd show up again. Even now, I still look over my shoulder, still feel like he's out there somewhere, watching. I don't think I'll ever feel safe again. I was out late, around 10:30, walking my dog, Daisy. I don't normally go that late, but I had a busy day, and she was getting antsy. I didn't think much of it since our neighborhood is quiet, even at night. I could go a whole block without seeing anyone, maybe a car passing here or there, but that's about it. We'd only gone a few minutes when I noticed a guy across the street, standing on the corner. At first, I thought he was just waiting for someone or taking a smoke break, something like that. He was looking our way, but I tried to ignore it. We were just out for a walk, right? I didn't owe anyone my attention. Daisy was sniffing around, as usual, probably taking her sweet time so she could drag the walk out longer. I let her, figuring we'd just take a loop around the block and head back. But when I looked up again, that guy was still there, just watching us. He hadn't moved an inch. Something about it made me uneasy, so I decided to turn down another street. I kept my eyes on Daisy, not wanting to look back and make it obvious I'd noticed him. We walked a little faster, and I hoped that'd be enough to shake whatever strange feeling I had. But as we reached the next block, I felt this prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like someone was watching. I couldn't help it, I glanced over my shoulder. He'd crossed the street. He was on our side now, a few paces behind us, moving at a casual pace, hands in his pockets, like he was out for a late-night stroll. The only problem was, he didn't have a dog with him. I told myself it didn't mean anything. Maybe he lived around here, just taking a walk like I was. That's what I wanted to believe, anyway. I tugged Daisy's leash, trying to subtly speed her up without making it obvious I was hurrying. She resisted at first, digging her nose into some patch of grass like it was the most interesting thing she'd ever smelled. My nerves were on edge, and I gave the leash another tug, a bit firmer this time. Finally, she got the hint and started walking. We turned down another block, but I could hear footsteps behind us. I didn't want to look again, but I couldn't help it. I glanced back, quick, like I was just looking around, and there he was. Closer this time. He still had his hands in his pockets, his eyes fixed on us, unblinking. When he noticed I was looking, he smiled. Not a friendly smile, more like he was amused by something. I felt a chill run through me, and I decided enough was enough. I took out my phone, planning to call someone, anyone, just to have a voice on the other end. But before I could dial, I heard him say, "She's got a lot of energy, doesn't she?" I froze. He was talking about Daisy. The casual tone, like we were acquaintances, made my skin crawl. I looked down at Daisy, who was still sniffing around, blissfully unaware of the tension in the air. "Yeah, she does," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. I didn't want him to know how uncomfortable he was making me. "We're just out for a quick walk." He nodded, but he didn't stop walking, just kept pace with us. "She likes to linger, though, doesn't she?" always curious about everything. Something about the way he said it made me uneasy. Daisy did like to sniff around a lot, but how would he know that? I decided to keep my answer short. Yep. She's a curious dog. I turned to walk faster, hoping he'd take the hint, but he matched my pace, staying just a step behind. You know, she's been like that since she was a puppy, he continued, like he was reminiscing about her. That stopped me in my tracks. I turned to look at him directly, feeling a rush of anger and fear. How would you know that? He just shrugged, smiling that same unsettling smile. I've seen you around. You and Daisy. She's a good dog, always well behaved. I hadn't seen this man before in my life. I was sure of it. And yet he was talking like he knew us, like he'd been watching us for a long time. My mind started racing, trying to figure out if I'd seen him somewhere, maybe in passing, but nothing came up. I decided it was time to go. Have a good night, I said, forcing a polite smile, and turned to walk away, tugging Daisy along with me. But before I could take a step, he said, "You really shouldn't pull on her leash like that. She doesn't like it." I felt a wave of nausea. Daisy did hate it when I pulled her leash, but there was no way he could know that unless he'd been watching us, studying us. I didn't look back this time. I just started walking, fast, practically dragging Daisy along, hoping to put some distance between us. But then I heard his footsteps again. Faster this time, closing the gap. "Hey, I'm just trying to help," he called out, his voice getting louder, more insistent. "I know Daisy pretty well. I could give you some tips if you're having trouble with her." My heart was pounding, and I could feel my hands shaking. I didn't respond, just kept moving, trying to stay calm. Daisy, sensing my anxiety, started pulling forward, which was a relief. She was finally helping me get out of there. But then he spoke again, his voice so close now I could feel his breath on the back of my neck. "She doesn't like strangers, does she?" he said, almost in a whisper. That was enough. I broke into a full sprint, practically dragging Daisy with me as I ran toward home. I didn't care if he was following or if he thought I was being rude. I just wanted to get out of there, to put as much distance as I could between me and that man. When I reached my house, I fumbled with the keys, hands trembling as I tried to unlock the door. I could still feel his presence, like he was standing right behind me, just waiting. Finally, the lock clicked, and I shoved the door open, pulling Daisy inside and slamming it shut behind us. I stood there for a moment, catching my breath, heart racing as I listened for any sounds outside. I heard nothing, just the quiet of the night, the faint rustle of leaves. I looked out the peephole, but he was gone. No sign of him anywhere. I spent the rest of the night double-checking the locks, peering out the windows, convinced he'd show up again. I didn't get a wink of sleep, every little sound making me jump. But he never came back. For days afterward, I felt like I was being watched. Every time I took Daisy out, I found myself glancing over my shoulder, scanning the streets for any sign of him. I never saw him again, but the memory of that night stuck with me, the way he spoke about Daisy like he knew her, like he'd been part of our lives all along. Now, I don't take Daisy out at night anymore. And I don't let my guard down, even during the day. One night, around 11, I headed down to do my laundry in the basement of my apartment complex. I knew it was late, but I work odd hours, and this was the only time I could squeeze it in. The laundry room was always dead quiet, especially at that hour, which suited me just fine. I usually had the whole place to myself, and I could get through it quickly without anyone hovering over the machines. That night, I took my hamper and detergent, went down, and started loading up one of the washers. I noticed right away that the room felt colder than usual. It was a poorly lit space, with only one flickering light bulb overhead. The walls were bare concrete, and it had that musty, almost damp smell that never went away, no matter how much they cleaned it. I tossed in my clothes, filled the machine with detergent, and started it up. I went back upstairs to wait, planning to return in about 40 minutes, just like always. I puttered around my apartment for a bit, tidying up, keeping one eye on the time. When the timer hit 40, I headed back down, expecting to toss my clothes into the dryer and be done with it. But when I got to the laundry room, the washer was empty. I stopped in my tracks, confused, then checked the machine again, wondering if I'd somehow forgotten to put my clothes in. But no, it was the right washer, and I knew I'd started it. My clothes were gone. I thought maybe someone had come down, taken my things out, and left them in the dryer, maybe figuring I'd be back late. Annoyed, I checked all the dryers, but they were all empty too. The room was dead silent. There was no one there. I started to feel uneasy, like maybe I wasn't alone after all. I looked around, listening for any sound that would tell me someone had been there recently, but it was just silent. That cold, empty kind of silence that starts to make your skin prickle. I went back up to my apartment, convinced maybe someone had taken my things by mistake. I waited a while, then went back down, hoping my clothes might have somehow been returned. When I walked into the laundry room, there they were. All my clothes, folded neatly in my basket, right on top of the washing machine. At first, I just felt relief, like, oh good, they're back. But then I realized something was off. Every piece was folded perfectly. I don't mean a sloppy kind of folding. I mean, they were folded like they were in a store display. My shirts were stacked, sleeves aligned perfectly. My jeans were rolled neatly, side by side. Even my socks were matched up and placed in pairs. I don't fold my clothes like that. Not even close. Then the smell hit me. There was this strong scent coming off them, like a man's cologne. Not mine. Not anyone I knew. It was this weird, musky smell that filled the whole room, almost like it had been sprayed on every piece. The scent was overpowering, and it felt wrong, like it didn't belong there, clinging to my things. I felt a weird chill go down my spine, and I didn't want to touch my clothes, but I couldn't just leave them. So, I grabbed the basket and practically ran back up to my apartment, that smell following me all the way. I shut and locked my door and just stood there, trying to shake off the feeling that something was very wrong. I couldn't understand how my clothes had ended up back there, or why someone would fold them like that, much less put cologne on them. I didn't want to think about it too much. I took them out, shook them out a little, and put them in my closet, just trying to forget about it. But every time I walked past that closet, that smell was there. It didn't fade. My whole apartment started to smell like it. I couldn't escape it. A week passed, and I convinced myself it had just been some weirdo in the building with nothing better to do. I even tried to laugh it off, thinking maybe someone was playing a prank, even though it didn't feel like that at all. Then, one night, I went down to do laundry again. I was nervous, but I figured it would be fine if I just kept an eye on my things this time. I loaded up the washer, started it, and decided to sit in the laundry room while it ran. I brought my phone and a book, figuring I'd wait it out. About halfway through the cycle, I heard something. It was faint, but it sounded like footsteps in the hallway just outside the laundry room. I froze, listening. The steps stopped right outside the door, and I felt my heart start pounding in my chest. I waited, but no one came in. I tried to convince myself it was just someone walking past, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they'd stopped on purpose, like they knew I was in there. The washer finished, and I threw my clothes into the dryer as fast as I could, all while keeping one eye on the door. I sat back down, waiting, the hum of the dryer the only sound. But the smell started to fill the room again. That same musky cologne, faint at first, but then getting stronger, like someone had sprayed it all over the place. I didn't know what to do. I kept glancing at the door, waiting for it to open, waiting for someone to come in, but no one did. My clothes finished drying, and I grabbed them as fast as I could, stuffing them into my basket without even checking if they were all there. I just wanted to get out of that room. When I got back to my apartment, I went through the clothes one by one, looking for anything strange. Everything was there, but that smell was all over them again. I had no idea how, but it was like it had soaked into the fabric, clinging to each piece, that same strange, musky scent. That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing sounds outside my door, footsteps down the hallway. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like someone was watching me, waiting just outside. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, that it was just paranoia, but the feeling didn't go away. For days, I was on edge. I kept my door locked at all times, and I avoided going to the laundry room unless I absolutely had to. But that smell never faded, no matter how many times I washed my clothes. It was like a reminder, something I couldn't escape, that followed me everywhere I went. Finally, I went down to the building manager, told him everything, how I thought someone was messing with me, leaving my clothes folded, spraying cologne on them. He looked at me like I was crazy, but he said he'd check the security cameras. I felt a small bit of relief, hoping it would prove I wasn't just imagining it. The next day, he called me into his office. I sat down, nervous, waiting for him to tell me who it was, maybe show me the footage. But he looked at me, almost apologetic, and said there was nothing. The cameras hadn't picked up anyone going in or out of the laundry room that night, or any night I'd mentioned. I couldn't believe it. He said the cameras must have been malfunctioning or maybe pointed in the wrong direction, but that he'd look into it. I could tell he didn't really believe me, but there was nothing more he could do. That was the last time I did laundry in that building. I started going to a laundromat a few blocks away, somewhere crowded, somewhere I felt safe. I'd see people folding their clothes, going through their normal routine, and I'd feel this weird ache, like I'd lost something normal that I'd never get back. The smell faded from my clothes eventually, but every once in a while, I swear I still catch a whiff of it, that same musky cologne, and every time, it brings me right back to that night. It was close to midnight, and I was out on a dark, nearly empty road, heading home after a long day. I'd been driving for hours, and my gas was running low, so I pulled into the only open gas station I'd seen in miles. The place was dead quiet, with just one dim light over the pumps and a small store that looked like it hadn't been cleaned in years. I remember thinking I'd be in and out in a few minutes. Just gas up and get back on the road. I parked by the pump and got out, feeling the cold night air settle over me. I hadn't seen anyone else around, no other cars in sight, so I assumed I was alone. The only sound was the low hum of the lights overhead, flickering every few seconds. I had just started filling the tank when I noticed a figure standing a little ways off, near the corner of the building. He was almost hidden in the shadows, just far enough that I hadn't noticed him at first. He didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, watching me. I tried to ignore it. People can be weird, sure, but not everyone's dangerous. Maybe he was just some guy hanging around, waiting for a ride, or maybe he worked there. I kept telling myself that, but something about the way he was just standing there, so still, had me on edge. I kept my eyes on the pump, counting the seconds, just wanting to get out of there. But then, as the tank was almost full, I saw him start to walk over. I tried not to look directly at him, but he was coming right toward me, so I had no choice. He was tall, probably a few years older than me, wearing an old, worn-out jacket. There was something off in the way he moved, slow but deliberate, like he had all the time in the world. "Hey," he said, stopping just a few feet away. "Could you give me a ride?" His voice was low, almost too calm. I remember feeling my stomach drop, and I kept telling myself to stay calm, to keep it casual. I gave him a small shake of my head, trying to sound polite but firm. "Sorry, man, I'm just passing through," I said, hoping that would be the end of it. But he didn't leave. Instead, he took a step closer. "Come on," he said, his voice a little sharper this time. "Just a quick ride. I don't need to go far." I felt my heart start to race. There was no reason for him to be this insistent, not when I'd already said no. I closed the gas cap and tried to act like everything was fine, like I wasn't getting more freaked out by the second. "Sorry, I can't help you," I repeated, this time a little louder, hoping he'd get the hint. I took a step toward my driver's side door, but before I could get there, he moved, blocking my way. He was right in front of my door, close enough that I could see his face under the light. His expression was flat, almost blank, but his eyes, there was something wrong with them. Like he was looking straight through me. "I really need a ride," he said, his tone almost pleading but with a hint of something darker behind it. "I don't think you get it." I swallowed, feeling trapped. I was out there alone, in the middle of nowhere, with no one around. I kept my hands at my sides, trying to act calm, even though every part of me was screaming to just get away. "I can't give you a ride," I said, forcing the words out. "I need to get home." He didn't move, just stood there, still blocking my door, his eyes fixed on mine. I glanced around, looking for anyone who might be nearby, but there was no one. Just me and him in that cold, empty gas station. I took a step back, hoping he'd take that as a sign to leave, but he just kept staring at me, that blank expression on his face, like he was weighing something in his mind. "Don't be difficult," he said finally, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "I just need a ride." That was when I knew he wasn't going to leave on his own. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, every instinct telling me to get out of there, to run. But he was still blocking my way to the car, and I didn't know what he'd do if I tried to push past him. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm not giving you a ride," I said, each word slow and firm. "Move away from my car." He didn't budge, just looked at me with this strange, almost disappointed expression, like I was letting him down somehow. Then, without a word, he took a step closer, his hand reaching out just enough that I thought he might grab me. I took another step back, my heart racing, and I felt something cold settle over me. This guy wasn't just some stranger asking for help. He'd been watching me, waiting, like he knew I'd be there, like this was planned. I said move, I told him, louder this time, hoping he'd realize I wasn't backing down. He gave me a long, hard look, his eyes narrowing, and for a second, I thought he might do something, that he'd lunge at me. But then he stepped back, just barely enough for me to get to the door. I didn't waste a second. I got in, locked the doors, and started the engine, all while he stood there, just staring at me through the window, his face inches from the glass. I put the car in reverse, pulling out of the station as fast as I could. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know if he was still watching, if he'd try to follow me. I just drove, my hands shaking on the wheel, my heart pounding so hard I could barely breathe. For miles, I kept checking the rearview mirror, expecting to see him there, maybe on foot, maybe in a car, but there was nothing. Just the empty road stretching out behind me. I didn't stop, didn't even slow down, not until I was close to home. That night, I barely slept. Every sound outside my window made me jump. Every creak in the owls had me thinking he'd somehow found me. I couldn't shake the feeling that he'd planned it, that he'd been waiting for someone, maybe anyone, just to pull in there alone. I still think about that night sometimes, every time I'm on a long drive, every time I stop at a gas station on an empty road. I always made sure to look around, to check the shadows, to keep my car between me and anyone who might be around. Because I know that feeling now, the feeling of being watched, of being trapped, and I never want to feel it again. I still don't know what came over me that day. I've always been one to enjoy hiking and exploring new places, but looking back, I can't help but feel that I should have known better. Maybe I had ignored too many signs, or maybe I was just too confident, thinking nothing could go wrong. Either way, that day was different. I should have turned around the moment I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, but I didn't. It started innocently enough. I was out on my usual weekend hike, just me, the woods, and the quiet. The trail I had chosen was one I had hiked before, but this time, I decided to try a smaller path that veered off to the side, almost like a forgotten or hidden route. I had been walking for a while when I noticed the trail starting to narrow. It was covered with overgrown brush, and the dirt was soft, almost like no one had walked here for a long time. I was curious, but not enough to turn back. After a few more minutes, the trail completely disappeared. I stood there for a moment, looking around, wondering if I should just go back the way I came. But then something caught my eye, a clearing just beyond the trees. It wasn't too far, and there seemed to be something else out there, maybe a path. I decided to check it out. What's the worst that could happen, right? The moment I stepped into the clearing, I felt like I had crossed some sort of invisible line. The air felt heavier, like it was pressing down on me. But I shrugged it off. I wasn't some paranoid person who was afraid of the woods. The clearing itself wasn't too remarkable, except for the strange feeling it gave me. It was big, about the size of a small backyard, and at the far end, I could see a small encampment. There were tarps stretched between trees, a few logs stacked up like seats, and an old fire pit in the center. It looked like a campsite, but not one that belonged to casual hikers. It had an odd, almost unsettling feel to it, as if it had been abandoned or maybe it was still being used. I hesitated for a moment, thinking about turning around. I didn't want to intrude on someone else's spot, but at the same time, I couldn't shake my curiosity. I approached slowly, trying to stay quiet and respectful, but as I got closer, I realized that there were strange totems hanging from the trees. They were made from sticks and old cloth, hanging in odd shapes and sizes. Some were wrapped in twine, and others had things like feathers or bones tied to them. I froze. It was like the air around me shifted. I could feel my heartbeat pick up. I wasn't sure what this place was, but it didn't feel right. There was something off about it. I turned to leave, thinking I'd seen enough, but then I heard a sound, footsteps, soft but distinct, coming from the bushes behind me. My heart started racing. I turned around quickly, expecting to see someone walking toward me, maybe just another hiker or someone setting up camp. But it wasn't a hiker. It was a man, stepping out of the woods. He looked disheveled, his clothes were torn, and his hair was unkempt, almost wild. His face was hard to read, but there was something in his eyes, something unsettling. He stopped when he saw me, and for a moment, neither of us moved. He was looking right at me, and I had the sinking feeling that something wasn't right. "What the hell are you doing here?" His voice was rough, like he hadn't spoken in days, and his eyes narrowed as he took a step forward. I instinctively took a step back. I didn't mean any harm. I was just exploring, saw the campsite. My voice trailed off, unsure of what to say. I didn't want to make him angry, but I also didn't want to stick around if things were going to get weird. "This is our space," he said, his words slow and deliberate. "You're trespassing." I wasn't sure what to make of that. Trespassing? I was in the woods, far off the trail, but it wasn't like I had stumbled across private property. This was public land. "I didn't know," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "I'll leave." I didn't mean to intrude. But the man didn't move. He just stood there, staring at me with those cold, unblinking eyes. Something in his stance made me uneasy, like he wasn't just some person who had found a spot to camp. He was something else, something more territorial, maybe. "You don't just find a place like this," he said, almost in a whisper. His eyes flickered to the totems hanging around the trees, then back to me. "People come here for a reason. And you don't belong here." I felt my breath catch. It wasn't like he was threatening me outright, but there was something about the way he spoke, like he wasn't just angry. I could feel a level of malice in his words, like he knew something I didn't. I knew I had to leave, and I needed to do it quickly. I took a step back, then another, but as I started to turn to go, the man suddenly stepped forward, blocking my path. I froze. My heart was pounding in my chest. I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. "You should have left when you had the chance," he muttered, almost as if talking to himself, then looked up at me again. "Now you're going to have to answer for it." His words didn't make sense. I wasn't doing anything wrong. I just found an abandoned campsite, and now I was trying to leave. But the more I stood there, the more I felt like I wasn't going to be able to leave. I glanced around, hoping for a way out. The clearing felt smaller, like the trees were closing in on me, like the air itself was thickening. I didn't wait to see what else he was going to do. I turned and ran. I pushed myself through the brush, not caring about the branches hitting me in the face or the uneven ground beneath my feet. I didn't look back. All I could think about was getting out of there, back to the main trail, back to safety. I ran until I could see the path again, and only then did I slow down. When I finally reached the main trail, I stopped to catch my breath. My heart was still racing, my chest heaving. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see the man coming after me, but when I turned, I saw nothing. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't run. I don't know who that man was or why he was there, but I'm never going back to that part of the woods again. I don't care how many forgotten trails there are out there. Some things are better left unexplored.